Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, 1. Goethe Prometheus, 1749 to 1775. 1. Growth. From the time when he trod the streets of Frankfurt am Main as consciously the grandson of its mayor, to his septuagenarian years when his casual conversation made the renown of his Boswell Eckermann, ran a full gamut of experience, absorbing all that life, love, and letters could give him, and returning it gratefully in wisdom and art. Frankfurt was a free city, dominated by merchants and fairs, but also the imperially designated seat for the coronation of German kings and Holy Roman emperors. In 1749 it contained 33,000 souls, nearly all pious, well-behaved, and gemütlich. Goethe's birthplace was a substantial four-story house, destroyed by fire in 1944, rebuilt in 1951. His father, Johann Caspar Goethe, was the son of a prosperous tailor and innkeeper. He ruined his political career by pride and arrogance, and retired from the practice of law to a life of amateur scholarship in his elegant library. In 1748 he married Katharina Elisabeth, daughter of Johann Wolfgang Textor, Schultheiss, or Bürgermeister, of Frankfurt. Her son never forgot that through her he belonged to the untitled patriciate that had ruled the city for generations. When he was 78, he told Eckermann, "We Frankfurt patricians always considered ourselves equal to the nobility, and when I held in my hands the diploma of nobility, granted him in 1782, I had nothing more, in my own opinion, than I had possessed long ago." He felt that nur die Lumpe sind bescheiden. Only rascals are modest. He was the eldest of 6 children, of whom only he and his sister Cornelia survived childhood. In those days much parentage was love's labor lost. It was not a happy household. The mother was of a kindly nature, inclined to humor and poetry, but the father was a pedantic disciplinarian who alienated his offspring by the harshness and impatience of his temper. With my father, Goethe recalled, there could be no pleasant relation. From him, as well as from experience as a privy councillor, Goethe may have derived something of the stiffness that showed in his later life. From his mother he may have taken his poetic spirit and his love of the drama. She built a marionette theatre in her home. Her son never recovered from its fascination. The children received their first education from their father, then from tutors. Wolfgang acquired a reading knowledge of Latin, Greek, and English, some Hebrew, and the ability to speak French and Italian. He learned to play the harpsichord and the violoncello, to sketch and paint, to ride and fence and dance. But he took life as his best teacher. He explored all quarters of Frankfurt, including the Judengasse. He ogled the pretty Jewish girls, visited a Jewish school, attended a circumcision, formed some notion of Jewish holy days. The Frankfurt fairs, by bringing into the city exotic faces and goods, added to his education. So did the French officers in the Goethe home during the 7 Years' War. In 1764, the 15-year-old boy saw the coronation of Joseph II as King of the Romans. He sucked in every bit of it, and spent 20 pages describing it in his autobiography. At 14, he had the first of the many love affairs that engendered half of his poetry. He had already won a reputation for his facility in writing verses. Some boys with whom he occasionally mingled asked him to compose a poetic letter in the style of a girl to a youth. He did so well that they had it delivered to a lovelorn member of the group as coming from the object of his devotion. This lad wished to answer in kind, but lacked wit and rhymes. Would Goethe compose a reply for him? Goethe consented, and in gratitude the lover paid the expenses of an outing for the group to a suburban inn. The waitress was a lass in her teens, called Margareta, Gretchen for short. Goethe gave that name to the heroine of Faust. Perhaps because of the romances he had read and the letters he had written, he was in a mood to appreciate the charm of girlhood. "The first propensities to love in an uncorrupted youth," he wrote at 60, "take altogether a spiritual direction. Nature seems to desire that one sex may by the senses perceive goodness and beauty in the other. And so by the sight of this girl and by my strong inclination for her, a new world of the beautiful and the excellent was revealed to me." He never lost that world, one woman after another stirred his sensitive spirit, almost always with reverence as well as desire. At the age of 73, he fell in love with a girl of 17. For a while he was too awed to speak to the charmer. I went to church for love of her, and during the long Protestant service I gazed my fill at her. He saw her again at her inn, seated, like another Gretchen, at a spinning-wheel. Now she took the initiative and gaily signed the second love letter that he had fabricated as from a girl. Then one of the group, whom Goethe had recommended to his grandfather, was caught falsifying bonds and wills. Wolfgang's parents forbade him further association with those boys. Gretchen moved to a distant town, and Goethe never saw her again. He was much put out when he learned that she had said, "I always treated him as a child." He was quite content now, in 1765, to leave Frankfurt and study law at the University of Leipzig. Like any eager youth, he read widely outside of his assigned subjects. He had already, in his father's library, browsed in Bayle's Dictionnaire historique et critique, with much damage to his religious faith. And as soon as I reached Leipzig, I tried to free myself altogether from my connection with the church. For a time he delved into mysticism, alchemy, even magic. This too entered Faust. He tried his hand at etching and woodcuts, studied the picture collection at Dresden, frequently visited the painter Oeser in Leipzig. Through Oeser he became acquainted with the writings of Winckelmann. Through these and Lessing's Laocoon, he received his first infusions of reverence for the classic style. He and other students were preparing a hearty reception for Winckelmann at Leipzig in 1768 when the news came that Winckelmann had been murdered in Trieste. The sense of beauty was predominant in his approach to the world. In religion he liked only its colorful and dramatic sacraments. He did not care for philosophy as written by philosophers, except Spinoza. He shuddered at logic and fled from Kant. He loved drama, wrote a worthless one at Leipzig, and composed poetry almost every day, even while listening to lectures on law. The poems, which he published as Das Leipziger Liederbuch, are in the style of Anacreon, playful, sometimes erotic. Yet I'm content and full of joy, if she'll but grant her smile so sweet, or if at table she'll employ to pillow hers, her lover's feet. Give me the apple that she bit, the glass from which she drank bestow, and when my kiss so orders it, her bosom, veiled till then, will show. Was this merely wishful thinking? Apparently not. He had found in Leipzig a pretty head, Annette Schönkopf, who was willing to enter at least the vestibule of love. She was the daughter of a wine merchant who served a midday meal to students. Goethe ate there frequently and fell in desire with her. She returned his ardor with judicious reserve and allowed other men to be attentive to her. He grew jealous and took to spying on her. They quarreled and made up, quarreled and made up, quarreled and parted. Even in these ecstasies he reminded himself that he was the grandson of a burgomeister, and that he had in him a daimon, the urge and drive of an omnivorous genius that demanded freedom for its full development to its own imperative destiny. Annette accepted another suitor. Goethe counted this a defeat and tried to forget it in dissipation. I had lost her really, and the frenzy with which I revenged my fault upon myself by assaulting in various frantic ways my physical nature, in order to inflict some hurt on my moral nature, contributed very much to the bodily maladies under which I lost some of the best years of my life. He sank into melancholy, suffered from nervous indigestion, developed a painful tumor in the neck, and woke up one night with an almost fatal hemorrhage. He left Leipzig without taking his degree, and returned to Frankfurt in September 1768 to face paternal reproofs and maternal love. During his long convalescence he made the acquaintance of Susanna von Klettenberg, an ailing, kindly Moravian pietist. Her serenity and peace of mind never left her. She looked upon her sickness as a necessary element of her transient earthly existence. He described her, years later, with sympathy and skill in the Confessions of a Beautiful Soul, which he inserted into Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre. But he recorded very debonairly her claims that his nervousness and melancholy were due to his failure to reconcile himself to God. Now I had believed from my youth upward that I stood on very good terms with my God. Nay, I even fancied that he might be in arrears to me, as I was daring enough to think that I had something to forgive him. This presumption was grounded on my infinite goodwill, to which, it seemed to me, he should have given better assistance. It may be imagined how often I got into disputes on this subject with my friends, which, however, always terminated in the friendliest way. Nevertheless, he experienced stray moments of piety, even to attending some sessions of the Moravian Brethren, but he was repelled by the mediocre intelligence of these simple people, and soon returned to his casual combination of pantheistic faith and rationalistic doubt. In April 1770 he departed for Strasbourg, hoping to get his law degree. A fellow student described him, then 21, as a handsome figure with a magnificent forehead and great flashing eyes, but added, all would not be smooth sailing with this young man, for he seemed to have a wild and unsettled air. Perhaps his long illness had unnerved him. His daimon was too unsettling to let him gain stability. But what youth with fire coursing in his blood can enjoy repose? When he stood before the great cathedral, he hailed it patriotically as not Catholic, but German architecture, our architecture, for the Italians can boast of none like it, still less the French. He had not yet seen Italy or France. Alone I climbed to the highest peak of the tower, and ventured at that elevation to step out on a platform which measured scarcely a square yard. I inflicted this terror and torture upon myself so many times until the experience became a matter of indifference to me. One of his professors noted that Herr Goethe behaved himself in a way which caused him to be regarded as a meretricious pretender to scholarship, a frantic opponent of all religious teaching. It was the well-nigh universal opinion that he had a slate loose in the upper story. A dozen new experiences served to feed his flame. He met Werther several times during the latter's stay in Strasbourg. Werther, 5 years older, dominated these encounters. Goethe, in a modest interlude, called himself a planet revolving around Werther's sun. He was disturbed by Werther's dictatorial tendency, but was stimulated by him to read old ballads, Macpherson's Ocean, and, in Wieland's translation, Shakespeare. But also he read Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot. Besides pursuing his work in law, he took courses in chemistry, anatomy, obstetrics, and he continued his study of women. He felt their charm with all the keen sensitivity of a poet, all the electric incandescence of youth. 47 years later he told Eckermann that he believed in a mysterious magnetic effect of one person upon another, and most of all through difference of sex. He was stirred by the light and prancing walk of girls, by the music of their voices and laughter, by the color and rustle of their dress, and he envied the intimacy of the flower they sometimes wore in their corsage or their hair. One after another of these magic creatures called to his blood, grew in his imagination, and moved his pen. There had already been Gretchen and Annetta, soon there would be Lotte and Lily and Charlotte, later Minna and Ulrike. But now at Sesenheim, near Strasbourg, there was the most appealing of them all, Friederike Brion. She was the younger daughter, 19 in 1771, of the town pastor, whom Goethe compared to Goldsmith's virtuous vicar of Wakefield. The pages about Friederike in Goethe's autobiography are the finest prose he ever wrote. Several times he rode out from Strasbourg to enjoy the unspoiled simplicity of this rural family. He took Friederike for long walks, for she was most at home in the open air. She fell in love with him and gave him all that he asked. In a lonely place in the forest we embraced each other with deep emotion, and gave each other the most faithful assurance that each loved the other from the bottom of the heart. Soon he was confessing to a friend that one is not happier by a hair's breadth by attaining the object of his wishes. Meanwhile he was writing in Latin his doctoral thesis, which affirmed, like Febronius, the right of the state to be independent of the Church. It won the approval of the university faculty. He passed the examinations, and on August 6, 1771, he received his degree as a licentiate at law. The time had come to leave Strasbourg. He rode out to Sesenheim to say goodbye to Friederike. When from my horse I reached her my hand, the tears stood in her eyes, and I felt very uneasy. Having at last escaped the excitement of a farewell, I, in a quiet and peaceful journey, pretty well regained my self-possession. Remorse came later. Gretchen had been taken away from me, Annetta had left me. Now for the first time I was guilty. I had wounded the most lovely heart to its very depths. And the period of a gloomy repentance, with the absence of a refreshing love, to which I had become accustomed, was most agonizing. It is sadly self-centered, but which of us, in the trial and error of love, has not wounded one or two hearts before winning one? Friederike died unmarried, April 3, 1813. 2. Goethe and Werther. In Frankfurt the new licentiate grudgingly practiced law. He visited Darmstadt occasionally and felt the influence of its cult of sentiment. He was now in a strong reaction against France, against French drama and its rigid rules, even against Voltaire. More and more he relished Shakespeare, who had put the nature of man, lawful or lawless, upon the stage. In this mood and in the exuberant vigor of youth he was ripe for Sturm und Drang. He sympathized with its rejection of authority, its exaltation of instinct over intellect, of the heroic individual over the tradition-imprisoned masses. And so, in 1772-73, he wrote Götz von Berlichingen. It was a remarkable performance for a lad of 23, a drama uniting war, love, and treachery in a story warm with zeal for liberty, exuding vitality, and holding the interest from beginning to end. Goetz was a knight whose right hand had been shot off in battle when he was 24, in 1504. An iron hand had been attached to his arm, and with it he wielded his sword as lethally as before. Refusing to acknowledge any overlord but the emperor, he became one of those robber barons who, in the name of freedom, claimed full authority on their lands, even to pillaging wayfarers and waging private war. In 1495, Emperor Maximilian I had issued an edict against private wars, under the double penalty of ban by the empire and excommunication by the church. Goetz of the Iron Hand rejected the ban as contravening traditional rights, and the play turned at first on the struggle between the rebel knight and the Prince-Bishop of Bamberg. Goethe, loving women much more than war, let the center of interest pass to Adelaide von Walldorf, whose beauty and wealth fired a dozen men with reckless passion. For her, Adalbert von Weislingen, another free knight, broke his alliance with Goetz and his troth with Goetz's sister Maria, and went over to the bishop. Perhaps in Weislingen's vacillating love, Goethe remembered his own unfaithfulness. He sent a copy of the play to Friederike by a friend, saying, "Poor Friederike will feel somewhat consoled when she sees that the faithless lover is poisoned." The author colored history to suit his drama. Gottfried von Berlichingen was not so noble and magnanimous as Goethe's Goetz, but such emendations are poetic licenses, like tortured rhymes. Forgivable, too, is the rough, wild speech which Goethe ascribed to his hero as echoing virility. When the play was produced in Berlin in 1774, Frederick the Great condemned it as a detestable imitation of the barbarism that he, like Voltaire, saw in Shakespeare, and he called upon German dramatists to seek their models in France. Herder at first agreed with Frederick, and told Goethe, "Shakespeare has ruined you." But he sent the published version to his friends with high praise. "You have hours of enchantment before you. There is an uncommon degree of authentic German power, depth, and sincerity in the piece, though now and then it is merely an intellectual exercise." The younger generation hailed Goetz as the supreme expression of Sturm und Drang. German readers were glad to hear of medieval knights, symbols of the mighty German character. Protestants relished the echoes of Luther in Brother Martin, who complains that his vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience are unnatural, who describes woman as the glory and crown of creation, welcomes wine as rejoicing the heart of man, and overturns an old adage by saying that joyousness is the mother of every virtue. Even Goethe's father, who had to help him with his law and regarded him as a deterioration of the paternal stock, admitted that perhaps there was something in the lad after all. In May 1772, the young advocate had to go on legal business to Wetzlar, seat of the imperial appellate court. Not at all absorbed in law, he wandered through fields, woods, and boudoirs, drawing, writing, absorbing. In Wetzlar he met Karl Wilhelm Jerusalem, poet and mystic, and Georg Christian Kästner, a notary whom Goethe described as distinguished by a calm and equable demeanor, clearness of view, serene and tireless activity, and so confident of advancement that he was already engaged to marry. Kästner described Goethe magnanimously. 23 years old, the only son of a very wealthy father. According to his father's intention, he was to practice law at the court here. According to his own, he was to study Homer and Pindar, and whatever else his genius, his taste, and his heart should inspire. Indeed, he has true genius, and is a man of character. He possesses an imagination of extraordinary vividness, and expresses himself in images and similes. His feelings are violent, but he is usually master of them. His convictions are noble. He is quite free from prejudice, and acts as he likes without caring whether it pleases others, or is the fashion, or is permissible. All compulsion is hateful to him. He loves children and can play with them for hours. He is a quite remarkable man. On June 9, 1772, at a country dance, Goethe met Kästner's betrothed, Charlotte Buff. The next day he visited her and found a new charm in womanhood. Lotte, then 20, was the eldest sister in a family of 11. The mother was dead, the father was busy earning a living. Lotte served as mother to the brood. She not only had the bright gaiety of a healthy girl, she also had the attractiveness of a young woman who, simply but neatly dressed, performed the duties of her place with competence, affection, and good cheer. Goethe soon fell in love with her, for he could not remain long without some feminine image warming his imagination. Kästner saw the situation, but, sure of his possession, showed an amiable tolerance. Goethe allowed himself almost the privileges of a rival wooer, but Lotte always checked him and reminded him that she was engaged. Finally, he asked her to choose between them. She did, and Goethe, his pride only momentarily shaken, left Wetzlar the next day, September 11th. Kästner remained his loyal friend till death. Before returning to Frankfurt, Goethe stopped at Ehrenbreitstein on the Rhine, the home of Georg and Sophia von der Roche. Sophia had 2 daughters, of whom the eldest, Maximiliana, soon particularly attracted me. It is a very pleasant sensation when a new passion begins to stir in us before the old one is quite extinct. Thus, when the sun is setting, one likes to see the moon rise on the opposite side. Maximiliana, however, married Peter Brentano and bore a lively daughter, Bettina, who fell in love with Goethe 35 years later. Goethe resigned himself to Frankfurt and law. Not quite, for at times he thought of suicide. Among a considerable collection of weapons, I possessed a handsome, well-polished dagger. This I laid every night by my bed, and before extinguishing the candle I tried whether I could succeed in plunging the sharp point a couple of inches deep into my heart. Since I could never succeed in this, I at last laughed myself out of the notion, threw off all hypochondriacal fancies, and resolved to live. To be able to do this with cheerfulness, I was obliged to solve a literary problem, by which all that I had felt should be reduced to words. For this purpose I collected the elements which had been at work in me for a few years. I rendered present to my mind the cases which had most affected and tormented me, but nothing would come to a definite form. I lacked an event, a fable in which they could be seen as a whole. A fellow advocate at Wetzlar provided the amalgamating event. On October 30th, 1772, Wilhelm Jerusalem, having borrowed a pistol from Kästner, killed himself in despair over his love for the wife of a friend. All at once, when I heard the news of Jerusalem's death, Goethe recalled, the plan of Werther was formed, and the whole ran together from all sides. Perhaps so, but it was not until 15 months later that he began to write the book. Meanwhile, he carried on with Maximiliana Brentano, who had moved with her husband to Frankfurt, a flirtation so persistent that the husband protested and Goethe withdrew. A variety of abortive literary projects distracted him. He dallied with the idea of retelling the story of the wandering Jew. He planned to have him visit Spinoza, and to show that Satan, to all appearances, was triumphing over Christ in Christendom. But he wrote only 10 pages of Der ewige Jude. He composed some satires on Jacobi, Wieland, Herder, Lenz, and Lavater, but managed to win their friendship nevertheless. He contributed to Lavater's Physiognomische Fragmente, and allowed him to physiognomize his head, with flattering results. Intelligence is here, with sensibility to kindle it, judged the Swiss. Observe the energetic brow, the eye so swiftly penetrating, searching, enamored, and the nose in itself enough to proclaim the poet. With the virile chin, the well-opened, vigorous ear, who could question the genius in this head? And who could live up to such a cephalogram? Jacobi thought it could be done, for after visiting Goethe in July 1773, he described him in a letter to Wieland as, from head to toe, all genius, a man possessed who is destined to act according to the dictates of the individual spirit. At last, in February 1774, Goethe wrote the book that gave him a European renown, Die Leiden des jungen Werthers. He had thought of it so long, had so long rehearsed it in brooding and fancy, that now he dashed it off, he tells us, in 4 weeks. I isolated myself completely. I forbade the visits of my friends. 50 years later he said to Eckermann, that was a creation which I, like the pelican, fed with the blood of my own heart. He killed Werther to give himself peace. He was inspired in making the book brief. He used the letter form, partly in imitation of Richardson's Clarissa and Rousseau's Julie, partly because it lent itself to the expression and analysis of emotion, and perhaps because in that form he could use some of the letters he had written from Wetzlar to his sister Cornelia or to his friend Merck. He shocked Charlotte and Kestner by giving her actual name, Lotte, to the object of a love obviously describing Goethe's passion for Kestner's bride. Kestner became Albert, and was favorably portrayed. Even the meeting at the dance and the morrow's visit were in the story as they had been in fact. Since that day sun, moon, and stars can go calmly about their business, but I am conscious neither of day nor of night, and the whole world around me is fading away. I have no more prayers to say except to her. Werther is not quite Goethe. He is more sentimental, more given to tears and gushing words and self-commiseration. In order to lead the narrative to its tragic denouement, Werther had to be changed from Goethe to Wilhelm Jerusalem. The final touches echo history. Werther, like Jerusalem, borrows Albert's pistol for his suicide, and Lessing's Emilia Galati lies on his desk as he dies. No clergyman escorted him to his grave. The Sorrows of the Young Werther was an event in the history of literature and of Germany. It expressed and promoted the romantic element in Sturm und Drang, as Goetz von Berlichingen had expressed the heroic. Rebellious youth acclaimed it with praise and imitation. Some dressed in blue coat and buff vest like Werther, some wept like Werther, some committed suicide as the only fashionable thing to do. Kestner protested at the invasion of his privacy, but was soon appeased, and we are not told that Charlotte complained when Goethe told her, "Your name is uttered in reverence by thousands of adoring lips." The German clergy did not join in the applause. A Hamburg preacher denounced Werther as an apology for suicide. Pastor Goetze, Lessing's enemy, blasted the book, and Lessing condemned it for its sentimentality and lack of classic restraint. At a public dinner, the Reverend J.C. Hasenkampf censured Goethe to his face for that wicked piece of writing, and added, "May God improve your perverse heart." Goethe deflated him with a soft answer, "Remember me in your prayers." Meanwhile, the little book swept through Europe in a dozen translations, 3 in France in 3 years. Now, for the first time, France admitted that Germany had a literature. 3. The Young Atheist. The clergy had some excuse for worrying about Goethe, for he was in this stage openly hostile to the Christian Church. He reveres the Christian religion, Kestner wrote in 1772, but not in the form our theologians give it. He does not go to church, nor to communion, and he rarely prays. Goethe was especially averse to the Christian emphasis on sin and contrition. He preferred to sin without remorse. He wrote to Werther, about 1774, "If only the whole teaching of Christ were not such bilge that I, as a human being, a poor limited creature of desires and needs, am infuriated by it." He planned a drama on Prometheus as a symbol of man defying the gods. He wrote little more than a prologue, which shocked Jacobi and pleased Lessing. What remains of it is the most radical of Goethe's anti-religious outbursts. Prometheus speaks. "Cover thy heaven, Zeus, with cloudy mist, and disport yourself, like a child who cuts off thistle-heads, on oaks and mountain peaks. My earth you must still let stand, and my cottage, which you did not build, and my hearth, whose glow you envy me. I know nothing poorer under the sun than you, O gods. You nourish your majesty with difficulty from sacrifices and votive prayers, and it would starve were not children and beggars such hopeful fools. When I was but a child and knew not what to think, my erring eyes turned to the sun, as if there might be an ear to hear my plaint, a heart like mine to pity a troubled soul. Who helped me against the Titan's insolence? Who rescued me from death, from slavery? Has not my own holy, glowing heart accomplished all this by itself, but young and good and deceived gives thanks to that sleeping one up there? Honor thee? Why? Have you ever lightened the sorrows of the heavy laden? Have you ever dried the tears of the anguish-stricken? Have I not been molded into a man by almighty time and everlasting fate, my masters and yours? Here sit I, forming men after my image, a race that may be like me, to grieve and weep, to enjoy and be glad, and to disdain you as I do." From this nadir of proud atheism, Goethe moved slowly to the gentler pantheism of Spinoza. Lavater reported that Goethe told us many things about Spinoza and his writings. He had been an extremely just, upright, poor man. All modern deists had drawn primarily from him. His correspondence, Goethe added, was the most interesting in the whole world as concerned uprightness and love of humanity. 42 years later, Goethe told Karl Zelter that the writers who had most influenced him were Shakespeare, Spinoza, and Linnaeus. On June 9, 1785, he acknowledged the receipt of Jacobi's book on the teachings of Spinoza. His discussion of Jacobi's interpretation reveals considerable study of the Jewish philosopher-saint. Spinoza, he wrote, does not demonstrate the existence of God. He demonstrates that existence, the matter-mind reality, is God. Let others call him an atheist on this account. I am inclined to call him and praise him as most godly, even most Christian. I receive from him the most wholesome influences upon my thinking and acting. In his autobiography, Goethe remarked on his reply to Jacobi, "Happily I had already prepared myself, having in some degree appropriated the thoughts and mind of an extraordinary man. This mind, which had worked upon me so decisively, and was destined to affect so deeply my whole mode of thought, was Spinoza. After looking through the world in vain to find a means of development for my strange nature, I at last fell upon the ethics of this philosopher. I found in it a sedative for my passions, and a free, wide view over the sensible and moral world seemed to open before me. I was never so presumptuous as to think that I understood perfectly a man who raised himself through mathematical and rabbinical studies to the highest reach of thought, and whose name, even at this day, seems to mark the limit of all speculative efforts." He gave added warmth to his Spinozistic pantheism by the intensity with which he loved nature. It was not merely that he found delight in bright fields or mystic woods, or plants and flowers multiplying with such exuberant diversity. He also loved nature's sterner moods, and liked to fight his way through wind or rain or snow, and up to perilous mountain tops. He spoke of nature as a mother from whose breast he sucked the sap and zest of life. In a prose poem rhapsody, Die Natur, from 1780, he expressed with religious feeling his humble surrender to, his happy absorption in, the generative and destructive forces that envelop man. Nature. By her we are surrounded and encompassed, unable to step out of her and unable to enter deeper into her. She receives us, unsolicited and unwarned, into the circle of her dance, and hurries along with us till we are exhausted and drop out of her arms. She creates ever new forms. What now is was never before. What was comes not again. All is new, and yet always the old. She seems to have contrived everything for individuality, but cares nothing for individuals. She is ever building, ever destroying, and her workshop is inaccessible. She has thought, and is constantly meditating, not as a man, but as nature. She has an all-embracing mind of her own. No one can penetrate her. She lets every child tinker with her, every fool pass judgment on her. Thousands stumble over her and see nothing. She has her joy in all. She is kindly. I praise her with all her works. She is wise and quiet. One can tear no explanation from her, extort from her no gift which she gives not of her own free will. She has placed me here, she will lead me away. I trust myself to her. She may do as she likes with me. She will not hate her work. In December 1774, Duke Karl August stopped at Frankfurt en route to seek a bride at Karlsruhe. He had read and admired Goethe von Berlichingen. He invited the author to meet him. Goethe came and made a favorable impression. The Duke wondered, might not this handsome and mannerly genius be an ornament of the Weimar court? He had to hurry on, but asked Goethe to meet him again on his return from Karlsruhe. Goethe spoke often of destiny, too little of chance. He might have answered that it was destiny, not chance, that brought him to the Duke, and that it turned him from the loveliness of Lili Schönemann to Weimar's unknown perils and opportunities. Lili was the only daughter of a rich merchant in Frankfurt. Goethe, now a social lion, was invited to a reception in her home. She performed brilliantly at the piano. Goethe leaned over a corner of it and drank in her 16-year-old charms as she played. I was sensible of feeling an attractive power of the gentlest kind. We grew into the habit of seeing each other. We were now necessary to each other. An irresistible longing dominated me. So rapidly can that famous fever rise, blown up by a poet's sensitivity. Before he quite realized what it meant, he was officially engaged in April 1775. Then Lili, thinking him securely captured, coquetted with others. Goethe saw and fumed. Just at this time, two friends, Counts Christian and Friedrich zu Stolberg, came to Frankfurt on their way to Switzerland. They suggested that Goethe join them. His father urged him to go, and to continue on into Italy. With some intimation, but without leave-taking, I separated myself from Lili. He started out in May 1775. At Karlsruhe he met the Duke again, and was definitely invited to Weimar. He went on to Zurich, where he met Lavater and Bodmer. He climbed St. Gothard, and looked longingly at Italy. Then the image of Lili regained ascendancy. He left his companions, turned homeward, and in September had Lili in his arms. But, back in his room, he felt again his old dread of marriage as imprisonment and stagnation. Lili resented his vacillation. They agreed to break off their betrothal. In 1776 she married Bernhard von Türkheim. The Duke, briefly at Frankfurt on his way back from Karlsruhe, offered to send a coach to take Goethe to Weimar. Goethe consented, made his arrangements, and waited for the appointed day. The coach did not come. Had he been played with and deceived? After some days of fretful delay, he started out for Italy. But at Heidelberg the promised coach caught up with him. The Duke's emissary made explanations and apologies. Goethe accepted them. On November 7th, 1775, he reached Weimar, aged 26, torn as always between eros and destiny, longing for woman, but resolved to be great. Goethe Counselor, 1775 to 1786. Goethe was welcomed to Weimar by all but the politicians. "I must tell you," wrote Wieland to Lavater, November 13, 1775, "that Goethe has been with us since Tuesday last, and that within 3 days I have conceived so deep an affection for this magnificent person, I so thoroughly see into him, feel and understand him, as you can far better imagine than I can describe." In that same month a member of the court wrote to Goethe's parents, "Conceive of your son as the most intimate friend of our dear Duke, loved to adoration, too, by all the good ladies hereabout." But there were clouds. The Duke relished wild hunts and drinking. Goethe at first accompanied him in both. Klopstock publicly charged the poet with corrupting a virtuous prince. Louisa feared that Goethe would alienate her husband from her. Actually, he used his influence to bring the Duke back to the Duchess, despite the fact that the marriage had not been one of love. Some officials distrusted Goethe as a Sturm und Drang radical with pagan beliefs and romantic dreams. Several gladiators of that movement, Lenz, Klinger, and more, rushed to Weimar, introduced themselves as Goethe's friends, and clamored for plums. When Goethe took a fancy to a garden house, outside the city gate but near the ducal castle, Karl August lost Goethe some public goodwill by evicting the tenants so that Goethe might move in, on April 21, 1776. There the poet found relief from court etiquette, and learned to grow vegetables and flowers. For 3 years he lived there all the year round, then only in the summer till 1782, when he moved to a spacious mansion in the town to attend to his mounting duties as a member of the government. The Duke had thought of him as a poet, and had invited him to Weimar as a literary ornament to his court. But he perceived that the 26-year-old author of a rebel play and a tearful romance was becoming a man of practical judgment. He appointed Goethe to a bureau of works, and asked him to look into the condition and operation of the mines at Ilmenau. Goethe did this with such assiduity and intelligence that Karl August determined to add him to the Privy Council that administered the duchy. A senior member protested against this sudden infusion of poetry and threatened to resign. The Duke and the Dowager appeased him, and on June 11, 1776, Goethe became Geheimer Legationsrat, Privy Councillor of Legation, at an annual salary of $1,200. He reduced his attentions to the ladies. For long now, Wieland informed Merck on June 24th, from the moment that he decided to devote himself to the Duke and the Duke's affairs, he has behaved with faultless wisdom and with worldly circumspection. In 1778 Goethe was advanced to the then peaceful post of Minister of War, and in 1799 to full membership in the Privy Council. He attempted some reforms, but found himself thwarted by vested interests at the top and public apathy below. Soon he himself was a complete conservative. In 1781 he was made president of the ducal chamber. In 1782 he was given by Joseph II a patent of nobility, and became von Goethe. In those days, he told Eckermann 45 years later, I felt so satisfied with myself that if I had been made a prince I should not have thought the change so very remarkable. Interwoven with his political career was the most lasting, intense, and poignant love affair in his life. Hear Dr. Johann Zimmermann's quite unmedical description of one of his patients in November 1775. The Baroness von Stein, wife of the chamberlain and master of the horse, has extraordinarily large black eyes of the highest beauty. Her voice is gentle and repressed. No one can fail to mark on her face seriousness, gentleness, kindliness, virtue, and profound sensibility. The manners of the court, which she possesses to perfection, have been transformed in her case into rare and high simplicity. She is very pious, with a touching and almost ecstatic elevation of soul. From her exquisite carriage and her almost professional skill in dancing, one would hardly infer the tranquil moonlight which fills her heart with peace. She is 33 years old. She has several children and weak nerves. Her cheeks are red, her hair quite black, her complexion of an Italian hue. Born in 1742, Charlotte von Schardt had married Baron Josias Gottlob von Stein in 1764. By 1772 she had borne 7 children, of whom 4 were now dead. When Goethe met her, she was still ailing from repeated pregnancies, and her sense of frailty entered into the modesty and diffidence of her character. Goethe idealized her, for he had the blood of a youth and the imagination of a poet, accustomed and commissioned to embellish reality. Yet he did not exceed her position in glorifying her. She was something new in his rosary of women. She was an aristocrat in whom fine manners seemed inborn, and Goethe saw her as enshrined in nobility. It was one result of their relationship that she transmitted to him the manners of her class, and schooled him in self-possession, ease, moderation, and courtesy. She was grateful for his love as restoring her interest in life, but she accepted it as a woman of breeding receives the adoration of a youth 7 years younger than herself, as the growth pains of an eager spirit seeking experience and fulfillment. It was not love at first sight. 6 weeks after joining the Weimar Circle, he was still writing verses about lovely Lily Schönemann. But on December 29, 1775, Dr. Zimmermann remarked Goethe's awakening to new virtues and beauties in Charlotte. By January 15th, he was trying to resist the incipient enthrallment. "I am glad to get away and wean myself from you," he told her. By January 28th, he had quite surrendered. "Dear angel," he wrote to her, "I'm not coming to the court. I feel too happy to stand the crowd. Suffer me to love you as I do." And on February 23rd, "I must tell you, O you chosen among women, that you have placed a love in my heart which makes me joyful." She wrote many letters in return, but from this first period only one survives. "I had so detached myself from the world, but now it grows dear to me again, dear through you. My heart reproaches me. I feel that I torment both myself and you. 6 months ago I was so ready to die, and I am ready no longer." He was in ecstasy. "There is no explanation for what this woman does to me," he told Wieland, "unless you accept the theory of transmigration. Oh, yes, once we were man and wife." He took the matrimonial privilege of quarreling and making up. Charlotte to Zimmermann, May 1776. "He stormed away from me a week ago, and then returned with overflowing love. What will he end by making of me?" Apparently she insisted upon their love remaining platonic, and he was too passionate to leave it so. "If I am not to live with you," he told her, "your love avails me no more than that of others who are absent." But on the next day, "Forgive me for making you suffer. I'll try hereafter to bear it alone." He was desolate when she went to far north Piedmont for a cure, but when she returned she visited him at Ilmenau from August 5th to 6th, 1776. On August 8th he wrote, "Your presence has had a wondrous effect upon me. When I think that you were here in my cave with me, and that I held your hand while you leaned over me, your relationship to me is both sacred and strange. There are no words for it, and the eyes of men cannot perceive it." Almost 5 years after their first meeting he was still warm. So, on September 12th, 1780, lonely in Zilbach, "Whenever I awake from my dreams, I find that I still love you and long for you. Tonight, as we were riding along and saw the lit windows of a house ahead, I thought, if only she were there to be our hostess. This is a rotten hole, and yet if I could live quietly here all winter long with you, I'd like it very well." And on March 12th, 1781, "My soul has so grown into yours that, as you know, I am inseparably tied to you, and neither height nor depth can part us. I wish there were some vow or sacrament which would bind me to you visibly and according to some law. How precious that would be! And surely my novitiate was long enough for me to take all due thought. The Jews have cords which they bind about their arms in the act of prayer. Thus I bind about my arm your dear cord when I address my prayer to you, and desire you to impart to me your goodness, wisdom, moderation, and patience. Some have interpreted the expired novitiate or period of probation as indicating Charlotta's physical surrender. And yet he wrote to her 6 years later, "Dear Lotta, you do not know what violence I have done to myself and still do, and how the thought that I do not possess you exhausts and consumes me." If consummation came, the secret was well kept. Baron von Stein, who did not die till 1793, bore with the liaison with the courtesy of an 18th-century gentleman. Occasionally Goethe ended his letters with regards to Stein. He had learned to love her children, too, feeling more and more keenly the lack of his own. In the spring of 1783, he persuaded her to allow her 10-year-old boy, Fritz, to stay with him for extended visits, even to accompany him on long trips. One of her letters to Fritz in September 1783 shows her maternal side and the human hearts behind the dehumanized facade of history. "I am so glad that you don't forget me out in the beautiful world, and that you write me intolerably, though not very well-formed, letters. Since you're staying much longer than I expected, I'm afraid that your clothes won't be looking very well. If they get soiled, and you too, tell Privy Councillor Goethe just to throw my dear little Fritz into the water. Try to appreciate your good luck, and to do your best to please the Councillor by your behavior. Your father wishes to be remembered to you." By 1785, Goethe's passion had subsided into long silences. In May 1786, Charlotta complained that Goethe thinks a great deal and says nothing. She was now 44, he was 37, and was retiring into himself. Often he went to Jena to get away from the Weimar court and seek rejuvenation among students. He had always refreshed himself with nature, climbing the Brocken, a 3,747-foot peak in the Harz Mountains, long associated with the Faust legend, and traveling with the Duke in Switzerland, from September 1779 to January 1780. Sometimes, in retrospect, he felt that during the first 10 years of my official and court life at Weimar I scarcely accomplished anything in the way of literature or science. But it was good that the poet had been crossed with the administrator, and that the half-spoiled youth and faithless lover had been disciplined by the responsibilities of office and the deferment of amorous victory. He made use of every experience and grew with every defeat. "The best thing about me is that deep inner stillness in which I live and grow, despite the world, and through which I gain what the world can never take from me." Nothing was lost on him. Everything found expression somewhere in his works. Finally, he was all the best of intellectual Germany fused into an integrated whole. Two of his greatest poems belong to this period: The Marriage of Philosophy and Religion, Poetry and Prose in Die Natur, and the most perfect of his lyrics, the second of those called Wanderer's Nachtlied, which he carved on the walls of a hunting lodge on September 7, 1780, perhaps in a mood of restless longing. "O'er all the hilltops is quiet now. In all the tree-tops hearest thou hardly a breath. The birds are asleep in the trees. Wait, soon, like these, thou too shalt rest." Another of Goethe's famous lyrics belongs to this stage of his development, the somber Erlkönig, which Schubert put to music. When has the child sense of mystic beings pervading nature been more vividly expressed than in this swift fantasy of the dying child who sees the king of the elves coming to snatch it from the arms of its father? Now, too, Goethe wrote in prose 3 dramas: Egmont in 1775, Iphigenia auf Tauris in 1779, and Torquato Tasso in 1780. Fruit enough for 5 political years. Egmont was not produced till 1788. Iphigenia was presented at the Weimar Theatre on April 6, 1779, 6 weeks before the premiere of Gluck's opera of the same name. But it was so transformed, as well as versified, during Goethe's stay in Rome that it will be better viewed as a product of Goethe's classic phase. Tasso also was remodeled and versified in Italy, but it belongs here as part of Goethe's enchantment with Charlotte von Stein. On April 19, 1781, he wrote to her, "All that Tasso says is addressed to you." Taking him at his word, she identified herself with Leonora, Goethe with Tasso, and Karl August with the Duke of Ferrara. Goethe readily accepted the legend that Tasso's mental breakdown at the Ferrara court was intensified, if not brought on, by an unhappy love affair with a sister of Alfonso II, who reigned from 1559 to 1597. He doubtless had himself in mind when he described the working of Tasso's poetic mind. His eye scarce lingers on this earthly scene, to nature's harmony his ear is tuned. What history offers, and what life presents, his bosom promptly and with joy receives. The widely scattered is by him combined, and his quick feeling animates the dead. Thus, moving in his own enchanted sphere, the wondrous man doth still allure us on to wander with him and partake his joy. Though seeming to approach us, he remains remote as ever, and perchance, his eye resting on us, sees spirits in our place. And Leonora, the stately princess who accepts the poet's love but bids him restrain his ardor within protocol, may well be Charlotte von Stein holding Goethe's passion this side of adultery. Tasso proclaims, and here both poets speak, "Whatever in my song doth reach the heart and find an echo there, I owe to one and one alone. No image undefined hovered before my soul, approaching now in radiant glory to retire again. I have myself with mine own eyes beheld the type of every virtue, every grace." Duke Alfonso resembles Karl August in patience with the poet's tantrums, amours, and reveries, and, like him, mourns the poet's delay in finishing a promised masterpiece. After each slow advance he leaves his task. He ever changeth and can ne'er conclude. Which well describes Goethe's piecemeal composition and his procrastination with Wilhelm Meister and Faust. Another princess praises Alfonso, Karl August, for giving Tasso Goethe a chance to mature by contact with affairs. And here rise famous lines. Talent forms itself in quiet. Character takes form in the stream of the world. But the correlation between the two poets fades at the end. Tasso shows none of Goethe's capacity for swimming in the worldly stream. He sinks into his realm of dreams, throws caution and proportion to the winds, clasps the startled princess in his arms, and goes insane when she removes herself from his embrace and his life. Perhaps Goethe felt that he had skirted that precipice. He often thought of Italy as an escape from a situation that threatened his mind. About this time, in the first form of Wilhelm Meister, he composed for Mignon a song of longing that fitted his own hopes rather than Mignon's. Know you the land where the lemon trees bloom, where the golden oranges glow in the dark foliage, where a soft wind blows from the blue sky, and the quiet myrtle and the lofty bay tree stand? Do you know it well? There would I go with you, O my beloved. Weimar was beautiful, but it was not warm, and the cares of office rasped the poet's soul. 'Tis a bitter way of earning one's bread to have to try to establish harmony among the discords of the world. Court life wearied him. I have nothing in common with these people, nor they with me. He had been partly estranged from the Duke, unable to keep the ducal pace of hunting and wenching. His one great love had been worn thin by time and quarrels. He felt that he had to break away from these many bonds, to seek a new orientation and perspective. He asked the Duke for a leave of absence. The Duke consented and agreed to continue Goethe's salary. To raise additional funds, Goethe sold to Gershon of Leipzig the right to publish an edition of his collected works. Only 602 sets were bought. Gershon lost $1,720 in the enterprise. On September 1st, 1786, Goethe wrote to Charlotte from Carlsbad, "Now a final farewell. I want to repeat to you that I love you dearly, and that your assurance that you are again taking pleasure in my love renews the joy of my life. I have borne much in silence hitherto, but I have desired nothing more intensely than that our relationship might take a form over which no circumstance could have power. If that cannot be, I would not dwell where you are, but rather be alone in that world into which I now go forth. 4. Goethe in Italy, 1786–88. He travelled under a pseudonym, Monsieur Jean-Philippe Müller, for he wished to be freed from the inconveniences of fame. He was 37 years old, but he came with even more than the bright expectancy of youth, and much better prepared, knowing something of Italy's history and art. On September 18th he wrote to Werther, "I hope to return a new-born person," and to Karl August, "I hope to bring back a thoroughly cleansed and far better equipped human being." To these and other friends he sent letters from Italy that still have in them the allegrezza of Italian life. He prefaced them with the old motto, "Auch in Arcadien." He, too, was now in Arcady. We have seen elsewhere how grateful he was for the sunshine. "I believe in God again," he cried out as he entered Italy. But he loved the Italian people, too, their open faces and hearts, the naturalness of their lives, the passion and jollity of their speech. Being a scientist as well as a poet, he made note of meteorological peculiarities, geological formations, mineral specimens, varieties of animals and plants. He liked even the lizards that darted over the rocks. He was so eager to reach Rome that he passed hurriedly through Venetia, Lombardy, and Tuscany, but he stopped long enough in Vicenza to feel the classic simplicity and power of Palladio's architecture. He strongly reaffirmed his antipathy to Gothic. "From all taste for those tobacco-pipe shafts, our little steeple-crowned towers and foliated terminals, I am now, thank God, set free forever. Palladio has opened the road for me to every art." Through that road he went back to Vitruvius, whom he studied in an edition by Galliani, our witty friend from Naples and Paris. The classical style now became a passion with him, coloring his works and thought, reforming some past productions like Iphigenia and Tasso into classic mold and line. In Venice the Baroque palaces seemed immodestly garish, too femininely elegant, and even from the Renaissance facades he turned to the relics of classic architecture and statuary in the museums. But his warm blood responded to the color and pride of Veronese and Titian. In Ferrara he sought in vain the palace where Tasso had been confined. After 3 days in Bologna and only 3 hours in Florence, he rushed on through Perugia and Terni and Città di Castello, and on October 29, 1786, he rode through the Porta del Popolo into Rome. Now he felt a passing moment of modesty. "All roads are open to me because I walk in a spirit of humility." Not yet master of spoken Italian, he sought out the German colony, and especially the artists, for he aspired to learn at least the elements of drawing, painting, and sculpture. Angelica Kauffmann admired his enthusiasm and good looks. She painted a portrait of him, stressing his black hair, lofty forehead, and clear eyes. He formed an intimate friendship with Johann Heinrich Wilhelm Tischbein, who handed him down to us in the famous Goethe in der Campagna, reclining at ease as if he had conquered Arcady. Long before coming to Italy, Goethe had corresponded with this painter. They met for the first time on November 3rd, when they converged in the Piazza San Pietro. The poet recognized the artist and introduced himself simply. "I am Goethe." Tischbein described him in a letter to Lavater. "I found him to be quite what I had expected. The only thing that surprised me was the gravity and tranquillity of one of such vivid sensibility, and also that he is able to be at ease and at home in all circumstances. What pleases me still more is the simplicity of his life. All he asked me to provide for him was a little room where he could sleep and work without interruption, and the very simplest fare. Now he sits in that little room and works at his Iphigenia from early in the morning till 9 o'clock. Then he goes out to study the great works of art." Tischbein often guided him in these explorations, made drawings for him, and secured for him copies of the more famous paintings. Goethe himself made sketches of what he especially wished to recall. He tried his hand at sculpture and modeled a head of Hercules. He admitted that he had no talent for the plastic arts, but he felt that these experiments gave him a better sense of form and helped him to visualize what he wished to describe. He pored over Winckelmann's History of Ancient Art. "Here on the spot I find it highly valuable. Now at last my mind can rise to the greatest and purest creations of art with calm consideration. The history of the whole world attaches itself to this spot, and I reckon a true new birth since the day I entered Rome. I think I am changed to the very marrow." Meanwhile, he seems to have enjoyed the living art provided by the dainty models who posed in the studios. His stay in Rome completed that de-romantification which had begun with the responsibilities of office. Now the lawlessness of Goethe and the tears of Werther seemed to the maturing Goethe signs of an unbalanced mind. "Romanticism is a disease," he said. "Classicism is health." There was something romantic in his new enthusiasm for classic marbles, columns, capitals, and pediments, and the pure lines of Greek statuary. If we really want a pattern, we must always return to the ancient Greeks, in whose works the beauty of mankind is constantly represented. Like Winckelmann, Goethe saw only the Apollonian side of Greek civilization and art, the exaltation of form and restraint. He now almost ignored that Dionysian ecstasy which so warmly colored Greek character, religion, and life, and which in Goethe himself had spoken through his daimon and his loves. It was in this classic rapture that he rewrote Iphigenia auf Tauris in verse in 1787, resolved to rival Racine, even Euripides himself. Still cherishing the embers of the fire that Charlotte von Stein had ignited in him, he poured into the speeches of the Greek princess something of the tenderness and self-control of the German baroness. He told the old story well, with all its complications of mythology and genealogy. He intensified the drama by portraying the Scythian king favorably, and he dared to change the ending to accord with the idea, rare among the Greeks, that one has moral obligations even to barbarians. Only those who can read German fluently can appreciate Goethe's performance, yet Hippolyte Taine, a Frenchman, a supreme critic and presumably familiar with Racine's dramas, said, "I place no modern work above Goethe's Iphigenia auf Tauris." The memories of Charlotte in this play, and still more in Torquato Tasso, which he rewrote in Rome, revived his feeling for her. She had been deeply wounded by his sudden flight to Italy, and by his leaving her boy in charge of a servant. She at once took Fritz back and demanded the return of all the letters she had written to Goethe. He wrote apologetically from Rome on December 8th, 13th, and 20th, 1786. She sent him on December 18th a note of bittersweet reproof. He answered on December 23rd, "I cannot express to you how it pierces my heart that you are ill, and ill through my fault. Forgive me. I myself fought with death and life, and no tongue can speak the things that went on within me." Finally she relented. "Now," he wrote on February 1st, 1787, "I can go to work in a happier mood, since I have a letter from you in which you say that you love, and take delight in my letters." In that month he and Tischbein went to Naples. He ascended Vesuvius twice. On his second attempt a minor eruption covered his head and shoulders with ashes. He revelled in the classic ruins at Pompeii, and marveled at the simple majesty of the Greek temples at Paestum. Returning to Rome, he took ship to Palermo, went on to study the classic temples at Segeste and Girgenti, Agrigento, stood in the Greek theatre at Taormina, and was back in Rome in June. More and more in love with the most remarkable city in the whole world, he persuaded Duke Karl August to continue his salary to the end of 1787. When that extension expired, he slowly reconciled himself to the north. He left Rome on April 25th, 1788, traveled leisurely through Florence, Milan, and Como, and reached Weimar on June 18th. Every day he wondered how the Duke, the court, and Charlotte would receive a Goethe who felt himself transformed. 5. Goethe Waiting, 1788 to 1794. With the absent poet's consent, the Duke had appointed a new president of the council. Now, at his own request, Goethe was relieved of all official duties except as Minister of Education, and henceforth he served the council only in an advisory capacity. The Duke was kind, but he had taken other intimates, and he did not like the semi-republican sentiments of the rewritten Egmont. The reading public had almost forgotten Goethe. It had taken up a new poet called Schiller, and had enthusiastically applauded a play, The Robbers, full of that Sturm und Drang rebelliousness and violence, which now seemed absurd and immature to a poet ready to preach classic order and restraint. Charlotte von Stein received him coldly. She resented his long absence, his leisurely return, his persistent rapture with Italy, and perhaps she had heard of those models in Rome. Their first meeting after his arrival was utterly false in tone, she wrote, and nothing but boredom was exchanged between us. She left for a stay in Kochberg, and Goethe was free to think of Christiane Vulpius. She came into his life on July 12, 1788, bearing a message from her brother. She was 23 years old and worked in a factory making artificial flowers. Goethe was struck with her fresh spirit, her simple mind, her budding womanhood. He invited her to his garden house as his housekeeper, and soon made her his mistress. She had no education, and cannot understand poetry at all, said Goethe, but she yielded herself trustfully and gave him the physical fulfillment that Charlotte had apparently refused. In November 1789, when she was nearing motherhood, he took her into his Weimar home and openly made her his wife in all but name. Charlotte and the court were shocked at his crossing class lines and his failure to veil the illicit relation. This reaction caused him and Christiane much grief, but the Duke, an old hand with mistresses, served as godfather to the child that was born on Christmas Day, 1789, and Werther, stern but forgiving, christened it August. Goethe, so often a lover but only now a father, found much happiness in The Little Man and Das kleine Weib, the little woman. She kept house for him, she listened to him lovingly even when she did not understand him, and she gave him health. "Since she first crossed this threshold," he told a friend, "I have had nothing but joy of her." Her only fault in his eyes was that she loved wine even more than he did, and that it sometimes led her to almost uncontrolled merriment. She frequented the theatre and went to many dances, while Goethe stayed home and celebrated her in his Römische Elegien, 1789 to 1790, written in the manner of Propertius and with the morals of Catullus. There is nothing mournful about these Roman elegies. They get their names from their elegiac meter of alternating hexameters and pentameters. And they concern not Rome, but a merry widow, through whose disguise we see Christiane herself. "All that thy sacred walls, eternal Rome, hold within them, teemeth with life, but to me all is still silent and dead. O, who will whisper unto me? When shall I see at the casement that one beauteous form, which, while it scorcheth, revives? Do not repent, mine own love, that thou so soon didst surrender. Trust me, I deem thee not bold. Reverence only I feel. Alexander and Caesar and Henry and Frederick the mighty on me would gladly bestow half of the glory they earned, could I but grant unto them one night on the couch where I'm lying. But they by Orcus's night sternly, alas, are held down. Therefore rejoice, O thou living one, blessed in thy love-lighted homestead, ere the dark Lethe's sad wave wetteth thy fugitive foot." That pretty widow may have been a Roman memory, but the warmth of these lines came from Christiane. After all, was he not studying art? "Yet it is studious, too, with sensitive hand, to mark her bosom's lovely curves, and let wise fingers glide down the smooth thigh, for thus I master the antique sculptor's craft, reflect, compare, and apprehend, to come and see with feeling eye, and feel with seeing hand." The Weimar ladies were not pleased by this cheapening exposure of their charms, and the stately Charlotte mourned the degeneration of her Galahad. Even Karl August was a bit disturbed, but was soon appeased. When the Dowager Duchess was returning from Italy, he sent Goethe to Venice to escort her home. His stay there, from March to June 1790, was protracted uncomfortably. He longed for Christiane, and vented his irritation with Italian shopkeepers and hygiene in Venezianische Epigramme, the least attractive of his works. On his return from Venice, he found that the French Revolution was arousing the youth of Germany to ecstasy and the rulers to fear. Many of his friends, including Wieland and Herder, were applauding the overthrow of monarchical absolutism in France. Goethe, perceiving that all thrones were threatened, took his stand beside the Duke and counseled caution. So many people, he said, were running about with bellows in their hands, when it seems to me they had better be looking for cold water jugs to control the fire. He obeyed the order of Karl August to accompany him in the campaign of the first coalition against France. He was present at the Battle of Valmy on September 20th, 1792, stood calmly under fire, and shared in the defeat. A German officer recorded in his diary that when the poet-councillor was asked to comment on the event, he answered, "From today and from this place begins a new epoch in the history of the world." We have no confirmation of this story. In any case, back in Weimar, Goethe wrote vigorously against the revolution, which was entering the period, 1792–94, of its excesses and savagery. These developments confirmed in Goethe the natural turn of the maturing mind from a zest for liberty to a love of order. As any fool can be original, so Goethe felt that any fool can live arbitrarily, safely violating customs or laws because others observe them. He had no enthusiasm for democracy. If ever such a system should actually be practiced, it would be the sovereignty of simplicity, ignorance, superstition, and barbarity. He was kindly and generous within his sphere, and spent part of his income in secret charities, but he shrank from the crowd. In the presence of multitudes or strangers, he withdrew proudly and timidly within himself, and found his only happiness in his home. In these unsettling years, from 1790 to 94, he fell into a sombre torpor from which he was aroused by the touch of Schiller's ardent youth and the competition of his pen. 6. Schiller Waiting, 1787 to 1794. When Schiller reached Weimar, Goethe was in Italy. The almost penniless poet admitted jealousy of the absent counsellor. While he is painting in Italy, the Toms, Dicks, and Harrys are sweating for him like beasts of burden. He is squandering a salary of 1,800 thalers there, and here they have to work double tides for half the money. On August 12, 1787, he wrote more favorably, "Goethe is spoken of here by many with a sort of devotion, and is even more loved and admired as a man than as an author. Herder says he has a most clear judgment, great depth of feeling, and the purest sentiments. According to Herder, Goethe is free from all spirit of intrigue. He has never done harm to anyone. In his political transactions he acts more openly and boldly. Herder says that as a man of affairs Goethe is more deserving of admiration than as a poet, that he has a mind large enough for anything." The Duke was away when Schiller came, but Anna Amalia and Charlotte von Stein received him cordially. Wieland told him that he was wanting in polish, clearness, and taste, and offered to polish him. Soon the eager poet was contributing to Wieland's Deutsche Merkur. He found more intimate entertainment with Charlotte von Kalb, who, like the other Charlotte, had a broad-minded husband. "People begin to whisper pretty loudly here about my connection with Charlotte. Herr von Kalb has written to me. He comes here at the end of September, and his arrival will greatly influence my arrangements. His friendship for me remains unchanged, which is astonishing, for he loves his wife, and is aware of my intimacy with her. But he can never for one moment doubt her fidelity. He still remains the honest, good-hearted fellow he always was." On August 27, 1787, Don Carlos had its premiere in Hamburg. Schiller was too fond of Weimar to attend. This, his first play in verse, was both praised and condemned as a surrender to the style of French tragedy, but it lacked the dramatic unity required by Aristotelian rules. It began with the conflict between Philip II and his son for the love of Elizabeth of Valois. Then, mid-play, the center of interest shifted to the struggle of the Netherlands to free themselves from Spanish suzerainty and Alva's cruelty. Schiller tried to give an impartial portrait of Philip, and Protestant readers applauded the appeal of Marquis Posa to the king. "Your Majesty, I lately passed through Flanders and Brabant, so many rich and blooming provinces, filled with a valiant, great, and honest people. To be the father of a race like this, I thought must be divine indeed. and then I stumbled upon a heap of burned men's bones. Restore us all you have deprived us of, and generous and strong, let happiness flow from your horn of plenty. Let man's mind ripen in your vast empire, and become amidst 1,000 kings a king indeed. Let every subject be what once he was, the end and object of the monarch's care, bound by no duty save a brother's love. Despite the success of Don Carlos, Schiller for a long time abandoned drama. In 1786 he had written to Körner, "History has with each successive day new attractions for me. I wish I had studied nothing else for 10 years altogether. I think I should have been another sort of being. Do you think there is yet time to make up for what I have lost?" He could not support himself, much less a family, on the proceeds of occasional plays that even after an applauded premiere might wither to an early death. Perhaps some successful work of history would give him sufficient reputation as a scholar to win a professorship at the University of Jena. There he would be only 14 miles from Weimar, and still within the jurisdiction and bounty of the Duke. So, after finishing Don Carlos, he gave his pen to A History of the Fall of the United Netherlands. As Schiller could not read Dutch, he relied on secondary authorities, from whose narratives he put together a compilation of no lasting worth. Körner criticized Volume 1 in 1788 with his usual honesty. "The present work, with all its talent, does not bear the stamp of that genius of which you are capable." Schiller abandoned the Netherlands. No second volume came. On July 18, 1788, Goethe returned from Italy, and in September met Schiller in suburban Rudolstadt. Schiller reported to Körner, "The high idea I had conceived of him is not lessened in the slightest degree, but I doubt if we shall ever draw very close to each other. He is so far ahead of me that we cannot meet on the road. His whole life from the very beginning has run in a direction contrary to mine. His world is not my world. On some points our notions are diametrically opposed." And indeed the two poets seemed providentially designed to dislike each other. Goethe, 39, had arrived and matured. Schiller, 29, was climbing and experimenting. Only in proud egotism did they agree. The younger man was of the people, poor, writing semi-revolutionary lines. The other was rich, a man of rank and state, a privy councillor, deprecating revolution. Schiller was just emerging from Sturm und Drang. He was the voice of feeling, sentiment, freedom, romance. Goethe, wooing Greece, was all for reason, restraint, order, and the classic style. In any case, it is not natural for authors to like one another. They are reaching for the same prize. When they returned to Weimar, Goethe and Schiller lived only a short walk from each other, but they did not communicate. Matters were worsened by the appearance of Schiller's hostile review of Goethe's Egmont. Goethe decided that Little Athens was not large enough to contain both of them. In December 1788 he recommended Schiller for a chair in history at Jena. Schiller gladly accepted and called on Goethe to thank him, but in February 1789 he wrote to Körner, "It would make me unhappy to be a great deal in Goethe's society. He never warms even toward his best friends. Nothing attaches him. I verily believe he is an egotist of the first water. He possesses the talent of putting men under an obligation to him by small as well as great acts of courtesy, but he always manages to remain free himself. I look upon him as the personification of a well-calculated system of unbounded selfishness. Men should not tolerate such a being near them. He is hateful to me for this reason, though I cannot do otherwise than admire his mind and think nobly of him. He has aroused in me a curious mixture of hatred and love." On May 11, 1789, Schiller took up his duties at Jena, and on May 26th he delivered his inaugural address on What is, and to what end does one study, universal history? Admission being free, the audience proved far too large for the room assigned, and the professor moved with his auditors in a gay stampede to a hall at the other end of town. This lecture was highly praised. The students gave me a serenade that night and 3 rounds of cheers. But enrollment for the course for which admission was charged was small, and Schiller's scholastic income was meager. He added to it by writing. In 1789-91 he brought out, in 3 installments, History of the 30 Years' War. Here he was at home, at least with the language, though again he was too harassed to go to the primary sources, and his predilection for judging and philosophizing colored and halted the tale. Nevertheless, Wieland hailed the work as indicating Schiller's capacity for rising to a level with Hume, Robertson, and Gibbon. 7,000 copies of Volume 1 were sold in its first year. Schiller now felt that he could indulge his longing for a home and for a woman to give him love and care. He had had a brief glimpse of Charlotte and Carolina von Lengefeld at Mannheim in 1784. He saw them again at Rudolstadt in 1787. Lotte was living there with her mother, and Carolina, unhappily married, was living next door. Both, without being pretty, Schiller wrote to Kerner, are interesting and please me exceedingly. They are well read in the literature of the day, and give proofs of a highly finished education. They are good performers on the piano. Frau von Lengefeld frowned upon the idea of her daughter marrying an impecunious poet, but Karl August gave him a small pension of 200 thalers, and the Duke of Saxe-Meiningen secured him a patent of nobility. He warned Lotte that he had many faults. She told him she had noticed them, but added, "Love is loving people as we find them, and if they have weaknesses, accepting them with a loving heart." They were married on February 22nd, 1790, and took a modest home in Jena. Lotte brought her own income of 200 thalers a year, gave him 4 children, and proved through all his tribulations a patient and tender wife. "My heart swims in happiness," he wrote, "and my mind draws fresh strength and vigor." He worked hard, preparing 2 lectures a week, writing articles, poems, and history. For months he labored 14 hours a day. In January 1791 he suffered 2 spells of catarrhal fever, involving gastric pains and expectoration of blood. For 8 days he lay in bed, his stomach rejecting all food. Students helped Lotte to care for him, and vied with one another as to who should sit up with me at night. The Duke sent me 6 of old Madeira, which, with some Hungarian wine, has done me good service. In May he was attacked by a fearful spasm, with symptoms of suffocation, so that I could not but think that my last moment had come. I took farewell of my loved ones, and thought to pass away any minute. Strong doses of opium, camphor, and musk, and the application of blisters relieved me most. A false report of his death alarmed his friends, and reached even to Copenhagen. There, on suggestions from Karl Reinhold and Jens Baggesen, 2 Danish noblemen, Duke Friedrich Christian of Holstein-Augustenburg and Count Ernst von Schimmelmann, offered Schiller an annual gift of 1,000 thalers for 3 years. He received it gratefully. The university excused him from teaching, but he lectured to a small private circle. Part of his new leisure he gave, at Reinhold's urging, to the study of Kant's philosophy, which he accepted almost completely, to Goethe's amusement and Herder's disgust, and perhaps with some detriment to Schiller's poetry. Now, in 1793, he sent forth his long essay on Grace and Dignity, which began the romantic cultivation of Die schöne Seele. A beautiful soul he defined as one in which reason and the senses, duty and inclination, are in harmony and are outwardly expressed in grace. The Copenhagen donors must have been alarmed to receive, as some return for their gift, a little volume entitled Letters on the Aesthetic Education of Mankind, 1793–94. Starting with Kant's conception of the sense of beauty as a disinterested contemplation of harmonious forms, Schiller argued, with Shaftesbury, that the feeling developed by the beautiful refines manners, and the aesthetic sense becomes one with morality. It is a consolation to read, in this pronouncement from Weimar's halcyon days, that Schiller, like Goethe, thought his generation decadent, sunk in profound moral degradation. When he turned back from philosophy to poetry, he found it difficult to recapture that boldness and living fire I formerly possessed. Critical discussion has spoiled me. But he insisted that the poet is the only authentic human being. The best philosopher is a mere caricature compared with him. And he exalted to the plane of celestial inspiration the function of the poet to teach and raise mankind. In a long ode, Die Künstler, the artists, from 1789, he described poets and artists as guiding mankind to the union of beauty with morality and truth. In another poem, Die Goethe Griechenlands, The Gods of Greece, 1788, he lauded the Greeks for their aesthetic sensibility and artistic creations, and argued with cautious obscurity that the world had become gloomy and ugly since the replacement of Hellenism by Christianity. He was already falling under Goethe's spell, as Goethe had fallen under Winckelmann's. Probably in both Schiller and Goethe the romantification of Hellas was an escape from Christianity. Despite some pious passages, Schiller, as well as Goethe, belonged to the Aufklärung. He accepted the 18th century faith in salvation by human reason rather than by divine grace. He retained a deistic belief in God, personal only in poetry, and a misty immortality. He rejected all churches, Protestant as well as Catholic. He could not bear sermons, even Herder's. In an epigram entitled Mein Glaube, My Faith, he wrote two famous lines. Which religion do I acknowledge? None of all those that you name to me. And why none? Because of religion. He wrote to Goethe on July 9, 1796, A healthy and beautiful nature, as you yourself say, requires no moral code, no law for its nature, no political metaphysics. You might as well have added that it requires no Godhead, no idea of immortality wherewith to support and maintain itself. Nevertheless, there were factors of imagination and tenderness in him that drew him back toward Christianity. I find that Christianity virtually contains the first elements of what is highest and noblest, and its various outward forms seem distasteful and repulsive to us only because they are misrepresentations of the highest. No sufficient emphasis has been placed upon what this religion can be to a beautiful mind, or rather what a beautiful mind can make of it. This explains why this religion is so successful with feminine natures, and why it is that only in women is it at all supportable. Schiller was not, like Goethe, physically built for thorough paganism. His face was handsome but pale, his frame tall but thin and frail. He distrusted the diurnal vacillations of the weather and preferred to sit in his room smoking and taking snuff. He contrasted himself with Goethe as idea versus nature, imagination versus intellect, sentiment versus objective thought. He was at once timid and proud, shrinking from hostility but always fighting back, occasionally irritable and impatient, perhaps because aware that his time was running out, often critical of others, sometimes envious. He had a tendency to moralize about everything and to take a high idealistic tone. It is a relief to find him enjoying the eroticism of Diderot's Les Bijoux Indiscrets. He analyzed his own talent well in an early letter to Goethe. The poetic mind generally got the better of me when I ought to have philosophized, and my philosophical mind when I wished to poeticize. Even now it often happens that imagination intrudes upon my abstractions, and cold reason upon my poetical productions. If I could obtain such mastery over these two powers as to assign to each its limits, as Goethe did, I might yet look forward to a happy fate, but alas, just when I have begun to know and to use my moral energies rightly, illness seizes me and threatens to undermine my physical powers. His ailment returned with fury in December 1793. He recovered, but the sense that he could not be cured and must expect recurrent seizures darkened his mood. On December 10th he wrote to Körner, I struggle against this with all the force of my mind, but I am always driven back. The uncertainty of my prospects, doubts of my own genius, which is not sustained and encouraged by contact with others, the total absence of that intellectual conversation which has become a necessity to me. These were the mental accompaniments of his physical trials. He looked with longing from Jena to Weimar to the enviably healthy Goethe, that mens sana in corpore sano. There, Schiller felt, was the man who could give him stimulus and support. If only the ice between them would melt, if only that 14-mile barrier would fall away. 7. Schiller and Goethe, 1794 to 1805. It fell for a moment when, in June 1794, both men attended in Jena a session of the Society for Natural History. Encountering Goethe as they left the hall, Schiller remarked that the biological specimens exhibited at the conference lacked life, and could offer no real help to understanding nature. Goethe emphatically agreed, and the conversation kept them together till they reached Schiller's home. The talk induced me to go in with him, Goethe later recalled. I expounded to him the Metamorphosis of Plants, a treatise in which Goethe had argued that all plants were variations of one primitive type, the Erbpflanze, and that nearly all parts of a plant were variations or developments of the leaf. He heard all this with much interest and distinct apprehension, but when I had done he shook his head and said, "This is not experiment, it is an idea." That is, it was a theory not yet verified by observation or test. The comment nettled Goethe, but he saw that Schiller had a mind of his own, and his respect for him grew. Schiller's wife, whom I had loved and valued since her childhood, did her best to strengthen our reciprocal understanding. In May of 1794, Schiller had signed a contract to edit a literary monthly to be called Die Horen. The Horae in Greek mythology were the goddesses of the seasons. He hoped to enlist as contributors Kant, Fichte, Klopstock, Herder, Jacobi, Baggesen, Körner, Reinhold, Wilhelm von Humboldt, August Wilhelm von Schlegel, and, best catch of all, Goethe. On June 3rd he sent to Weimar a letter addressed to Hochwohlgeborener Herr, Hochsouveränender Herr Geheimer Rat, High and well-born Sir, highly honored Sir Privy Councillor, a prospectus of the proposed magazine, and added, "The enclosed paper expresses the wish of a number of men whose esteem for you is unbounded, that you would honor the periodical with contributions from your pen, in regard to the value of which there can be but one voice among us. We feel, Your Excellency, that your consent to support this undertaking will be a guarantee of its success." Goethe replied that he would gladly contribute, and was certain that a closer connection with the sterling men who form your committee will arouse to new life much that is now stagnant within me. So began a correspondence that is among the treasures of literary history, and a friendship whose exchange of respect and aid, lasting for 11 years, till Schiller's death, should enter into our estimate of mankind. Perhaps the most revealing of the 999 extant letters is the fourth, of August 23, 1794, in which Schiller, after several meetings with Goethe, analyzed with both courtesy and candor, both modesty and pride, the differences between their minds. My recent conversations with you have put the whole store of my ideas in motion. Many things about which I could not come to a right understanding with myself have received new and unexpected light from the contemplation I have had of your mind, for so I call the general impression of your ideas upon me. I needed the object, the body, to several of my speculative ideas, and you have put me on the track for finding it. Your calm and clear way of looking at things keeps you from getting lost in the side roads into which speculation, as well as arbitrary imagination, are so apt to lead me astray. Your correct intuition grasps all things, and that far more perfectly than what is laboriously sought for by analysis. Minds like yours seldom know how far they have penetrated, and how little cause they have to borrow from philosophy, which in fact can only learn from them. Although I have done so at a distance, I have long watched the course which your mind has pursued. You seek for the necessary in nature, but you look at nature as a whole when seeking to get light thrown on her individual parts. You look for the explanation of the individual in the totality of all her various manifestations. Goethe's answer, on August 27th, cleverly avoided an analysis of Schiller's mind. For my birthday, which occurred this week, I could have received no more agreeable gift than your letter, in which, with a friendly hand, you sum up my existence, and in which, by your sympathy, you encourage me to a more assiduous and active use of my powers. It will be a pleasure to unfold to you at leisure what your conversation has been to me, how I too regard those days as an epoch in my life, for it seems to me that after so unexpected a meeting we cannot but wander on in life together. Goethe followed this up on September 4th with an invitation to Schiller to come and spend some days with him in Weimar. You could take up any kind of work you like without being disturbed. We would converse together at convenient hours, and I think we would not part without some profit. You should live exactly as you like and as much as possible as if you were in your own home. Schiller readily accepted, but warned Goethe that the asthmatic spasms from which I suffer oblige me to stay in bed all morning, since they leave me no peace at night. So from September 14th to 28th, Schiller was Goethe's guest, almost his patient. The older man took tender care of the ailing poet, guarded him against annoyance, gave him dietetic counsel, taught him to love fresh air. Back in Jena, Schiller wrote on September 29th, "I find myself at home again, but my thoughts are still in Weimar. It will take me a long time to unravel all the ideas which you have awakened in me." Then, on October 8th, with characteristic eagerness, he urged, "It seems to me necessary that we should come at once to some clear understanding about our ideas of the beautiful." There followed 3 months of preparation for the first number of Die Horen. This appeared on January 24th, 1795, the second on March 1st, the rest monthly for 3 years. Goethe reported from Weimar on March 18th, "People are running after it, snatching the numbers from one another's hands. We could not want more for a beginning." On April 10th, Schiller informed Goethe, "Kant has written me a very friendly letter, but begs for a delay in sending his contributions. I am glad we have induced the old bird to join us." Goethe asked that his own pieces be unsigned, for they included several of his Roman elegies, and he knew that their lusty sensuality would seem unbecoming in a privy councillor. In the rash enthusiasm of success, Schiller persuaded Goethe to join him in another periodical, Der Musenalmanach, which appeared yearly from 1796 to 1800. The liveliest pieces in this were the Xenian, that the two poets wrote on the model of Martial's Xenia. Epigrams written as gifts to guests. Schiller described the project to Körner. "The whole affair consists in a conglomeration of epigrams, of which each is a single couplet. They are chiefly wild and impish satires, especially against authors and their works, interspersed here and there by sudden flashes of poetical or philosophical ideas. There will be no less than 600 of such monodistics." Goethe had suggested this plan as a way to strike back at their critics, to make fun of pompous authors and bourgeois tastes, and to stir the German reading public to a keener interest in literature. They would send these gifts into the camp of the Philistines like foxes with burning tails. The epigrams were unsigned, and some of them were the joint product of the two conspirators. Since many of these burning tales were directed at authors or controversies now forgotten, time has extinguished their fire, but one of them, by Goethe, especially merits remembrance. "Always strive for the whole, and if you yourself cannot become a whole, tie yourself to some whole as a serving part." Another distich, usually credited to Schiller, extends the thought. "You are frightened by death? You wish to live undying? Live in the whole. When you are long gone hence, it will remain." The satirical part of the Xenian brought counterattacks which made Schiller suffer and Goethe laugh. Goethe advised Schiller to let his work be his sole reply. "After our mad venture with the Xenian, we must take pains to work only on great and dignified works of art, and shame all our adversaries by transforming our protean natures into noble forms." It was done. In these years of their developing friendship, Goethe and Schiller wrote some of their finest poems. Goethe, The Bride of Corinth, and The God and the Bayadeer. Schiller, The Walk, in 1795, The Cranes of Ibycus, in 1797, and The Song of the Bell, in 1800. Schiller added a major essay, Über naive und sentimentalische Dichtung, in 1795, and Goethe sent forth Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre in 1796. By naive and sentimental poetry, Schiller meant poetry born of objective perception versus poetry developed by reflective feeling. Secretly, he was comparing Goethe and Schiller. The naive poet is not simple or superficial or deluded. He is one who is so readily adjusted to the external world that he feels no opposition between himself and nature, but approaches reality through direct and unhesitating intuition. Schiller cites Homer and Shakespeare as examples. As civilization becomes more complex and artificial, poetry loses this subjective immediacy and subjective harmony. Conflict enters the soul, and the poet has to recapture through imagination and feeling, as an ideal remembered or hoped for, this concord and union of the self with the world. Poetry becomes reflective, clouded with thought. Schiller believed that most Greek poetry was of the naive or direct sort, and most modern poetry the result of discord, disunity, and doubt. The ideal poet is he who will fuse both the simple and the reflective approaches in one vision and poetic form. Goethe later pointed out that this essay became a fountainhead of the debate between classical and romantic literature and art. The embryology of Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre illustrates Goethe's method of creation. He conceived the story in 1777, completed Book 1 in 1778, put it aside, and did not finish Book 2 until July 1782. He worked on Book 3 until November of that year, and on Book 4 till November 1783. Books 5 and 6 dragged along for 3 years more. He called these 6 books Wilhelm Meister's Theatralische Sendung, and read parts of them to friends. Then he laid them aside. He took up the tale again in 1791 on the urging of Werther and Anna Amalia, added 2 books by June 1794, submitted the growing manuscript to Schiller, who sent back criticisms, suggestions, and encouragement as the pages came. It was almost a picture of a midwife assisting at a long-overdue birth. At last, in 1796, the whole was delivered to the press. No wonder the final product was slightly deformed, weak in structure, adipose and confused, excellent only in parts and in its mirroring of Goethe's uncertain wandering amid conflicting interests and vague ideals. That decisiveness and self-confidence which Schiller ascribed to him were the proud concealment of internal vacillation and strife. Lehrjahre, learning years, expressed the period of apprenticeship in the German guilds. Through that time of tutelage, Wilhelm became Meister, master. So the meandering theme of the novel is Wilhelm's slow and painful apprenticeship in the guild of life. Because of the puppet shows Goethe had loved as a child, and his continuing interest in the theatre, he tied the tale to a troupe of actors passing through a dozen towns and 100 vicissitudes as lessons in living and pictures of German ways. Faithful to his own unfaithfulness, he made his hero enter upon the scene by deserting his mistress Mariana. Wilhelm is not an alluring character. He lets himself be carried from one situation or idea to another by the whim of circumstance or the power of personality. It is the woman who takes the initiative in his love affairs. Born a bourgeois, he flounders in admiration for men of noble birth, and humbly hopes that these will someday recognize the aristocracy of the mind. Philina is more attractive, a pretty actress who waltzes lightly from love to love, but graces her erotic tourism with a contagious gaiety and an absolving unconsciousness of sin. Unique is little Mignon, who follows her old father dutifully as he strums his harp in penny-gathering peregrinations. Goethe describes her as speaking very broken German, but puts into her mouth that perfect song, Kennst du das Land? She falls in adolescent love with Wilhelm, who loves her as a child, and she dies in grief when she sees him in Therese's arms. Ambroise Thomas plucked her out of these 800 pages to make of her a sad and delightful opera in 1866. Schiller praised the calm serenity of the style in Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre, and the truth to life in the description of a wandering troupe, but he pointed out contradictions in chronology, psychological improbabilities, offenses against taste, and faults in characterization and design. He proposed changes in the plot and gave his ideas as to how the story should end. Goethe assured him, "I shall certainly comply with your just wishes as far as I possibly can." But he confessed to Eckermann 33 years later that it was all he could do to protect his novel from Schiller's influence. Other critics were less friendly. One described the book as a brothel on tour, and Charlotte von Stein complained that when Goethe deals with lofty emotions, he always flings some dirt at them, as if to deprive human nature of any pretensions to the divine. The novel did not deserve these indiscriminate censures. It has many pleasant pages and can still carry the interest of readers freed from the tumult of the world. On March 23, 1796, Schiller went again to Weimar as Goethe's guest. There they worked together for the theatre. Goethe was a strict manager, chose the plays to be presented, and trained the actors. All that was morbid, weak, lachrymose, or sentimental, as well as all that was frightful, horrible, or offensive to decorum, was utterly excluded. The audience was usually confined to the court, except when some students were invited from Jena. August von Schlegel remarked acidly, "Germany has two national theaters, Vienna with a public of 50,000 and Weimar with a public of 50. Schiller returned to Jena April 12th, stimulated by his renewed contact with the stage to revert from history, philosophy, and incidental poetry to the drama. He had long thought of writing a play on Wallenstein. Goethe urged him to proceed with it. In November, Goethe went to Jena and lived for some time in daily communication with Schiller. Back in Weimar, Goethe wrote, "Do not fail to make use of your best hours, so as to get on with your tragedy, that we may begin to discuss it." While Schiller worked on Wallenstein, Goethe, stirred to rivalry by the success of Johann Heinrich Vosse's verse idol of German life and sentiment, Louisa, of 1795, tried his hand at this favorite genre, and published in 1798 Hermann und Dorothea. Hermann is the strong and healthy, shy and quiet son of a bilious father and tender mother, who keep the Golden Inn and an extensive farm in a village near the Rhine. They learn that hundreds of refugees are approaching from a frontier town captured by the French. The family make up parcels of clothing and food, which Hermann conveys to the refugees. He finds among them a lass with swelling bosom and neatly shaped ankles, who is serving them with aid and comfort. He falls in love with her, and after due tribulations brings her home to his parents as his bride. The story is told in fluent hexameters. Vignettes of rural life give color to the tale. Calls for the expulsion of the French invaders pleased patriotic Germans who had found Iphigenia auf Taurus and Torquato Tasso foreign and recondite, and the little epic gave new popularity to an author who, since Werther, had had few readers outside the Saxe-Weimar Duchy. Schiller's star was in the ascendant from 1798 to 1800. On November 28, 1796, he wrote to Körner, "I am still brooding seriously over Wallenstein, but the unfortunate work is still before me, shapeless and endless." He began it in prose, put it aside, then started it again in verse. The material was partly familiar to him from his studies for his History of the 30 Years' War, but it was so abundant, so complex in characters and events, that he abandoned the attempt to compress it into 5 acts. He decided to preface the drama with a 1-act prologue called Wallenstein's Lager, Wallenstein's Camp, and to divide the remainder into 2 plays. Di Piccolomini expounded the plot to depose the rebellious general, and set it off with a fiery love affair between Wallenstein's daughter and the son of a leader in the plot. The final and essential drama would be Wallenstein's Tod. When Goethe read the prologue, he was so struck by the realistic portrayal of an army camp and the clever preparation for later developments that he insisted on staging Wallenstein's Lager in the Weimar Theatre on October 12, 1798, before Di Piccolomini was complete. Perhaps it was a subtle way of keeping the poet to his task. Early in 1799, Schiller went to Weimar to stage Di Piccolomini. It had its premiere on January 30th and was well received. He returned to Jena and worked feverishly on The Death of Wallenstein. A letter of March 19, 1799, reveals the mood of a writer emerging from the ardor of creation. "I have long dreaded the moment when I should be rid of my work, much as I wished that moment would come, and in fact I feel my present freedom to be worse than the state of bondage that I have been in heretofore. The mass which has hitherto drawn and held me to it has now gone, and I feel as if I were hanging indefinitely in empty space." Excitement enough came with the rehearsals and premiere, on April 20th, 1799, of Wallenstein's Tod. Its success was complete. Even the highly critical Weimar audience felt that it had witnessed a masterpiece of dramatic presentation. Schiller had now reached the peak of his development. He had shortened the speeches and intensified the action. He had drawn all the leading characters with vitality and power. He had brought all the threads of the plot together in the tragic denouement, the ignominious death of a great man ruined by limitless ambition and pride. Schiller felt that he could now stand on an equality with Goethe, and in the field of drama he was justified. Probably at Goethe's suggestion, the Duke added 200 thalers to Schiller's pension and invited him to reside in Weimar. On December 3, 1799, the family moved to a house so close to Goethe's that for a time the two poets saw each other every day. Meanwhile, carried onward by his triumph, Schiller had flung himself into another play. "Thank God," he wrote to Kerner on May 8, 1799, "I have already hit upon a new subject for a tragedy." For his Maria Stuart, he studied the historical background, but he laid no claim to writing history. He proposed to write a play using history as material and background. He rearranged events and chronology for dramatic consistency and effect. He stressed the unpleasant elements in Elizabeth's character, and made Mary an almost immaculate heroine, and he brought the two queens face to face in a dramatic confrontation. History knows of no such meeting, but the scene is one of the most powerful in the literature of the stage. When it was presented at Weimar, June 14, 1800, Schiller was again exalted with success. By July he was at work on Die Jungfrau von Orleans. Here, too, he revised history to his purpose. In place of burning the Maid, he pictured Joan as escaping from her English captors, rushing into battle to rescue her king, and dying in victory on the field. The premiere at Leipzig on September 18, 1801, was the greatest triumph that Schiller ever had. Was Goethe jealous of his friend's sudden rise to ascendancy on the German stage? He rejoiced over it, and 28 years later he still judged Wallenstein's Tod so great that there is nothing else like it of the kind. However, he did not rank his rival as high in poetry as in drama. He felt that Schiller had clouded his poetry with philosophy and had never quite mastered the music of verse. When some admirers of Schiller wished to stage a tribute to him in the Weimar theatre, Goethe forbade it as too ostentatious. In July 1800 he went to Jena, while Schiller remained in Weimar. But on November 23rd, Schiller still spoke in terms of friendship unimpaired. He ranked Goethe as the most gifted man since Shakespeare. In the 6 years of our intimacy, no slightest doubt of his integrity ever arose. He possessed the highest veracity and sense of honor, and the deepest earnestness in the pursuit of what is right and good. I wish, he added, that I could justify Goethe as warmly in respect of his domestic relations. Through false notions of what constitutes domestic happiness, and through an unhappy fear of marriage, he has slipped into an entanglement which oppresses him and makes him wretched in his very home, and which he is too weak and soft-hearted to shake off. This is his only vulnerable spot. Schiller's wife, like the other ladies of Weimar, would not receive Christiane in her home, and Schiller rarely mentioned Christiane in his extant communications with Goethe. Despite these flaws in the friendship of the Dioskuren, as they were sometimes called, it at least proved that a classic and a romantic genius might live in harmony. They sent messages to each other almost every day. They frequently had supper together. Goethe often put his carriage at Schiller's disposal. He sent to Schiller a portion of the order which my wine merchant has just delivered. "Let us have a walk together toward evening," Goethe wrote on April 20th, 1801. And on June 11th, "Farewell, give my kind greetings to your dear wife, and gladden me on my return from Göttingen by showing me some fruits of your industry." And on June 28th, 1802, "A key to my garden and garden-house will be given you. I want you to have as good a time there as possible." 22 years after Schiller's death, Goethe said to Eckermann, "It was fortunate for me that I found Schiller, for different as our natures were, our tendencies were still toward one point, which made our connection so intimate that one really could not live without the other." In the final years of their alliance, each was handicapped by disease. For the first 3 months of 1801, Goethe suffered from nervousness, sleeplessness, violent influenza, and abscesses that for a time closed his eyes. At one stage he was unconscious for so long that Weimar expected his death. On January 12th, Charlotte von Stein wrote to her son Fritz, "I did not know that my former friend Goethe was still so dear to me, and that a serious illness, which overcame him 9 days ago, would so shake me to the very core." She took Christiana's boy, August, into her home for a while to ease the burdens that Goethe's sickness had laid upon his mistress, who tended him tirelessly. His recovery was slow and painful. "It is hard," he wrote to Charlotte, "to find the way back." In 1802, Schiller, now prosperous from the rising proceeds of his acted and published plays, bought a home in Weimar for 7,200 gulden, and Goethe, then in Jena, helped him to sell the house he had lived in there. On March 17, 1803, Schiller produced Die Braut von Messina, a self-confessed attempt to rival Sophocles' Oedipus, by portraying, with a divided chorus, the strife of two brothers in love with a woman who turns out to be their sister. The play did not please. Goethe experienced a similar setback when, in 1803, he staged Die natürliche Tochter. Among the spectators at a performance of The Natural Daughter was a brilliant and volatile lady, Germaine Necker, Madame de Stael, who was gathering material for her book, De l'Allemagne. She saw Schiller for the first time in December 1803, in the salon of the Duke and Duchess of Weimar, in a society as enlightened as it is exalted. He read French very well, but he had never spoken it. I maintained with some warmth the superiority of our dramatic system over that of all others. He did not refuse to enter the lists with me without feeling any uneasiness from the difficulty and slowness with which he expressed himself in French. I soon discovered so many ideas through the impediment of his words. I was so struck with the simplicity of his character. I found him so modest, so animated, that I vowed him from that moment a friendship full of admiration. Schiller prepared Goethe for her. She represents the intellectual culture of France in its purity. The only trouble with her is her quite extraordinary volubility. One has to turn oneself into one concentrated organ of hearing in order to follow her. He brought her to Goethe on December 24th. Goethe reported, "A most interesting hour. I didn't get a chance to say a word. She speaks well, but far too much." Her own report was identical, except for a slight change. She said that Goethe had talked so much that she had not a chance to speak one syllable. Her book served as a revelation to France of Germany as the native land of thought. "It is impossible," she wrote, "that the German writers, the best informed and the most reflecting men in Europe, should not deserve a moment's attention to be bestowed upon their literature and their philosophy." Resolved to win back the audience that had rejected The Bride of Messina, Schiller, at Goethe's suggestion, chose for his next drama the popular story of William Tell. He was soon on fire with the theme. After he had gathered all necessary material, Goethe recalled in 1820, he sat down to work and did not get up from his chair until the play was finished. If weariness overcame him, he laid his head on his arm and slept a while. So soon as he awoke, he asked for strong black coffee to keep himself awake. So the play was written in 6 weeks. Schiller accepted as history the legend of a William Tell who had led the revolt of the Swiss against Austria in 1308. The revolt was real, so was Gessler, the hated Austrian bailiff. Gessler, in the legend, promised Tell full pardon if he proved his feigned prowess with bow and arrow by shooting an apple from his boy's head. Tell placed 2 arrows in his belt. With the first he shot the apple. Gessler asked for what he had intended the second. Tell answered, "For you, if the first should strike my son." The play was acclaimed at Weimar on March 17, 1804, and soon thereafter everywhere. Switzerland adopted it as part of its national lore. Published, the play sold 7,000 copies in a few weeks. Schiller was now more famous than Goethe. But he had less than a year of life left to him. In July 1804, he had so violent an attack of colic that his doctor feared for his death, and Schiller hoped for it. He recovered slowly and began another play, Demetrius, the false Dmitri of Russian history. On April 28, 1805, he saw Goethe for the last time. From that meeting, Goethe returned to his home and himself fell seriously ill with colic. On the 29th, Schiller's final sickness began. Heinrich Voss reported, "His eyes were sunk deep in his head, and every nerve twitched convulsively." The unhealthy tensions of literary effort, the inflammation of his bowels, and the decay of his lungs joined to destroy him. Schiller never drank much, said Goethe later. He was very temperate, but in such hours of bodily weakness he was obliged to stimulate his powers with spirituous liquors. On May 9th, Schiller met death with a strange calm. He bade farewell to his wife, his 4 children, and his friends. Then he fell asleep and did not wake again. An autopsy showed the left lung completely destroyed by tuberculosis, the heart degenerated, the liver, the kidney, and the intestines all diseased. The doctor told the Duke, "Under the circumstances we cannot help wondering how the poor man could have lived so long." Goethe was so ill at the time that no one dared tell him of Schiller's death. On May 10th, Christiana's sobbing revealed it to him. "I thought I was losing my own life," he wrote to Zelter, "and instead I lost a friend who was the very half of my existence." With what remained he came to his own fulfillment. Goethe Nestor, 1805 to 1832. 1. Goethe and Napoleon. Shall we, honoring our stated limits, leave Goethe suspended at this point, with Faust on his pen and wisdom in his age? Or shall we, burdening space and risking time, pursue this ever-evolving Olympian to his end? Die ewige Weisheit zieht uns hinan. Timeless wisdom draws us on. On October 14, 1806, Napoleon defeated the Prussians at Jena. Duke Karl August, allied with Prussia, had led his own little army against the French in that battle. The routed survivors, and then the hungry victors, entered Weimar, sacked the stores, and quartered themselves in private homes. 16 Alsatian troops took over Goethe's house. Christiana gave them food, drink, and beds. That night, 2 other soldiers, intoxicated, forced their way in, and finding no more beds available on the lower floor, ran upstairs into Goethe's room, brandished their swords in his face, and demanded accommodations. Christiana placed herself between these soldiers and her mate, persuaded them to leave, and then bolted the door. On the 15th, Bonaparte reached Weimar and restored order. Instructions were issued that the distinguished scholar was not to be disturbed, and that all measures should be taken to protect the great Goethe and his home. Marshals Lannes, Ney, and Augereau stayed with him for a while, and then left with apologies and compliments. Goethe thanked Christiana for her bravery, and said to her, "God willing, we shall be man and wife." On October 19th they were married. His good mother, who had borne lovingly with all his faults, and modestly with all his honors, sent them renewed blessings. She died on September 12, 1808, and Goethe inherited half of her estate. In October 1808, Napoleon presided over a meeting of 6 sovereigns and 43 princes at Erfurt, and remade the map of Germany. Duke Karl August attended, taking Goethe in his retinue. Bonaparte asked Goethe to visit him on October 2nd. The poet came and spent an hour with the conqueror Talleyrand, 2 generals, and Friedrich von Müller, a Weimar magistrate. Napoleon complimented him on his vigor. Goethe was then 59, inquired about his family, and launched into a spirited critique of Werther. He condemned current dramas that emphasized fate. "Why talk about fate? Politics are fate. Qu'en dit Monsieur Goethe? What does Monsieur Goethe say about it?" We do not know Goethe's reply, but Müller reported that as Goethe was leaving the room, Napoleon remarked to his generals, "Voilà un homme! Behold a man." On October 6th, Napoleon returned to Weimar, taking with him a company of actors from Paris, the great Talma among them. They played, in Goethe's theatre, Voltaire's La Mort de César. After the performance, the emperor took Goethe aside and discussed tragedy. "The serious drama," he said, "could very well be a school for princes as well as for the people, for in certain ways it is above history. You ought to portray the death of Caesar more magnificently than Voltaire has done, and show how happy Caesar, Napoleon, would have made the world if the people had only granted him time in which to carry out his lofty plans." And a little later, "You must come to Paris. I make this definite request of you. You will there obtain a larger view of the world, and you will find a wealth of themes for your poetry." When Napoleon passed through Weimar again, after his disastrous retreat from Moscow, he asked the French ambassador to convey his greetings to Goethe. The poet felt that in Bonaparte he had met, as he expressed it, the greatest mind the world has ever seen. He quite approved Napoleon's rule of Germany. After all, Goethe had written in 1807, there was no Germany, only a farrago of petty states, and the Holy Roman Empire had ceased to exist in 1806. It seemed good to Goethe that Europe should be united, especially under so brilliant a head as Bonaparte's. He did not rejoice over Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, though his duke again led the Weimar regiments against the French. His culture and concern were too universal to let him feel much patriotic glow, and he could not find it in him, though often asked to do so, to write songs of nationalistic fervor. In his 80th year he said to Eckermann, "How could I write songs of hatred when I felt no hate? And between ourselves, I never hated the French, although I thanked God when we were rid of them. How could I, to whom the only significant things are civilization and barbarism, hate a nation which is among the most cultivated in the world, and to which I owe a great part of my own culture?" In any case, this business of hatred between nations is a curious thing. You will always find it most powerful and barbarous on the lowest levels of civilization. But there exists a level at which it wholly disappears, and where one stands, so to speak, above the nations, and feels the weal or woe of a neighboring people as though it were one's own. This level was appropriate to my nature. I had reached it long before my 60th year. Would that there had been in every major state 1,000,000 such good Europeans. 2. Faust, Part 1. Goethe did not accept Napoleon's invitation to move to Paris or to write about Caesar. He had long nurtured in his mind and his manuscripts a subject that moved him more deeply than even the most majestic political career, the struggle of the soul toward understanding and beauty, the defeat of the soul by the brevity of beauty and the elusiveness of truth, and the peace obtainable by the soul through narrowing the goal and broadening the self. But how to vision all this in a modern parable and dramatic form? For 58 years Goethe tried. He had learned the story of Faust in his childhood through chapbooks and puppet shows, and he had seen pictures of Faust and the devil on the walls of Auerbach's cellar in Leipzig. He himself in youth had meddled with magic and alchemy. His own restless search for understanding went into his conception of Faust. His reading of Voltaire and his contact with Herder's sarcasms went into Mephistopheles. The Gretchen whom he had loved in Frankfurt and the Friederike Brion whom he had deserted in Zensenheim gave name and form to Margaret. How deeply the story of Faust moved Goethe, how varied the forms it took in his thought, shows in the fact that he began to write the play in 1773 and did not finish it till 1831. Of his meeting with Herder in 1771 he wrote in his autobiography, "I most carefully concealed from him my interest in certain subjects which had rooted themselves in me and were, little by little, moulding themselves into poetic form. These were Götz von Berlichingen and Faust. The significant puppet show of the latter resounded and vibrated, many-toned, within me. I, too, had wandered about in all sorts of science, and had early enough been led to see its vanity. I had, moreover, tried all sorts of ways in real life, and had always returned unsatisfied and troubled. Now these things, as well as many others, I carried about with me, and delighted myself with them in solitary hours, but without writing anything down." On September 17, 1775, he told a correspondent, "I felt fresh this morning and wrote a scene of my Faust." Later in that month, Johann Zimmermann asked him how the play was progressing. He brought in a bag filled with 1,000 fragments of paper and threw it on the table. "There," he said, "is my Faust." When he went to Weimar in November 1775, the first form of the drama was complete. Dissatisfied with it, he put it aside. This Urfaust, or original Faust, never reached print till 1887, when a manuscript copy made by Fräulein von Goechhausen was found in Weimar. Through 15 more years he revised and expanded it. Finally he published it in 1790 as Faust, ein Fragment, which now runs to 63 pages. This was the first printed form of the most famous play since Hamlet. Still discontent with it, Goethe dropped the theme till 1797. On June 22nd he wrote to Schiller, "I have determined to take up my Faust again, breaking up what has been printed, arranging it in large masses, and further preparing the development. I only wish that you would be so good as to think the matter over in one of your sleepless nights, and tell me what you would demand of the whole, and to interpret my dreams to me like a true prophet." Schiller replied the next day, "The duality of human nature and the unsuccessful endeavor to unite in man the godlike and the physical is never lost sight of. The nature of the subject will force you to treat it philosophically, and the imagination will have to accommodate itself to serve a rational idea." Goethe's imagination was too rich, his vividly remembered experiences too many. He inserted many of them into the fragment, doubling its size, and in 1808 he gave the world what we now call Faust, Part 1. Before letting his puppet say a word, he prefixed to the drama a tender Zeugnung, dedication to his dead friends, and a droll prologue in the theatre between manager, playwright, and jester, and a prologue in heaven, wherein God bets Mephistopheles that Faust cannot be permanently won to sin. Then at last Faust speaks in simplest doggerel. "I have studied, alas, philosophy, jurisprudence, and medicine too, and saddest of all theology, with ardent labor through and through. And here I stick, as wise poor fool as when my steps first turned to school. Master they style me, nay, doctor forsooth, and nigh 10 years over rough and smooth, and up and down, and a crook and a cross, I led my pupils by the nose, and know that in truth we can know naught. This 4-foot meter, handed down from Hans Sachs's playlets, proved to be just the rippling rhythm for a drama that chastened philosophy with fun. Faust, of course, is Goethe, even to being a man of 60 years, and, like Goethe, he was still at 60 thrilled by feminine loveliness and grace. His double aspiration for wisdom and beauty was the soul of Goethe. It challenged the avenging gods by its presumption, but it was noble. Faust and Goethe said yea to life, spiritual and sensual, philosophical and gay. By contrast, Mephistopheles, who is not Satan, but only Satan's philosopher, is the devil of denial and doubt, to whom all aspiration is nonsense, all beauty a skeleton wearing skin. In many moments Goethe was this mocking spirit too, or he could not have given him such wit and life. At times Mephistopheles seems to be the voice of experience, of realism and reason, checking the romantic desires and illusions of Faust. Indeed, Goethe told Eckermann, the character of Mephistopheles is a living result of an extensive acquaintance with the world. Faust does not sell his soul unconditionally. He agrees to go to hell only if Mephistopheles shows him a pleasure so durably satisfying that he will be glad to stay with it forever. If ever on the bed of sloth I loll contented ever, then with that moment end my race. Should I to any moment say, tarry a while, you are so fair, then may you into fetters cast me, then will I gladly go down there. On this condition Faust signs the compact with his blood, and cries recklessly, our glowing passions in a sensual sea now will we quench. So Mephistopheles takes him to Margaret, Gretchen. Faust finds in her all the charm of that simplicity which departs with knowledge and returns with wisdom. He woos her with jewels and philosophy. Margaret. Tell me, how is't with thy religion, pray? Thou art a good and kindly man, and yet I think small heed thereto dost pay. Faust. Enough, dear child, I love thee, thou dost feel. For those I love my blood and life I'd spill, nor of his faith, his church, would any man bereave. Margaret. That is not right. We must believe. Dost thou believe in God? Faust. What man can say, my dearest, I believe in God? Margaret. Then thou believest not? Faust. Thou winsome angel face, mishear me not. Who can name him? Who thus proclaim him? I believe him? Who that has feeling, his bosom stealing, can say I believe him not? The all-embracing, the all-sustaining, clasps and sustains he not thee, me, himself? Springs not the vault of heaven above us? Leath not earth, firm stablished neath our feet? Great though it be, fill thou therefrom thine heart, and when in the feeling wholly blessed thou art, call it then what thou wilt. Call it bliss, heart, love, God. I have no name for it. Feeling is all, name is but sound and smoke clouding the glow of heaven. Margaret. It seemeth fair in these words of thine, but yet thou hast no Christianity. Faust. Dear child. She is moved not by his cloudy pantheism, but by the fine figure and raiment with which Mephistopheles' magic has endowed his restored youth. She sings at her spinning wheel a song of wistful longing. My peace is fled, my heart is sore, I shall find it never and nevermore. Him only I watch for, the window near, him only I look for, when forth I fare. His lofty gait, his lordly guise, the smile of his lips, the might of his eyes. My bosom yearns for him, for him. Ah, could I clasp him and cling to him and kiss him as fain I would, then I, faint with his kisses, should swoon and die. All the Western world knows the rest of the story, if only through Gounod. Margaret, in order to kiss and swoon unchaperoned, gives her mother a sleeping potion, from which the mother never wakes. Faust kills Margaret's brother, Valentine, in a duel, and then disappears. Margaret, in shame and grief, kills her fatherless child. She is arrested and condemned to death. Faust visits her in her dungeon and begs her to escape with him. She embraces him, but refuses to leave her cell. Mephistopheles draws Faust away, while a voice from heaven cries, "She is redeemed." Only slowly did the reading public realize that this Faust of 1808 was the finest drama and the finest poetry that Germany had yet produced. But some alert few recognized it at once as fit to stand among the peaks of the world's literature. Friedrich Schlegel compared Goethe with Dante. Jean-Paul Richter equaled him with Shakespeare. Wieland gave him in the realm of poetry the same sovereignty that Napoleon then held in government and war. 3. Nestor in Love. In the years 1818 to 1821, Goethe had two soul-stirring romances, not counting Bettina Brentano. On April 23, 1807, Bettina, 22, came to the aging poet with a letter of introduction from Wieland. She was the granddaughter of Sophia von La Roche, who had loved Wieland, and she was the daughter of Maximiliana Brentano, who had flirted with Goethe. She felt that she had a primogenital lien on Goethe's heart. Soon after entering his room, she flung herself into his arms. He accepted her as a child, and thereafter corresponded with her in that sense, but he enclosed with his letters the latest love poems he had written, and though they were not addressed to her, she treated them as declarations of passion, and gave them that color in the Goethes Briefwechsel mit einem Kinde, Goethe's correspondence with a child, which she published in 1835. Most of the poems had been inspired by Wilhelmina Herzlieb. Minna, as Goethe soon called her, was the daughter of a Jena bookseller. He had known her as a child, but in 1808 she was 19, modest, tender, and blooming. She hung on every word that he spoke, and mourned that age and status forbade her to love and possess him. He perceived her feeling, responded to it, wrote sonnets to her, punning on her name as a loving heart, but he recalled that he had only recently made Christiana his wife. He seems to have had Minna in mind when he portrayed the shy, high-strung, affectionate Ottilia of the Elective Affinities in 1809. This remark